Sometimes the greatest danger doesn't come from a stranger in the night, but from the person sitting quietly beside you. On the surface, it seemed like the perfect fresh start. A man rebuilding his life after heartbreak, finally finding love and creating the future he'd always dreamed of. But beneath that hopeful story, something else was stirring. An obsession that would turn into something far deadlier. This isn't just a story about love found and lost. It's about how easily trust can disguise a predator, and how one man's desperate attempt to possess another would end in a plot twist too disturbing to imagine. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder, all things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded. I woke Rupert up. Rupert's sitting in the background if you're just listening to this. And I made him upset. Are you okay? It's okay. I thought I'd bring Detective Rupee back. He was peeing for a while there. He was peeing in his bed. Oh, in his kennel. He's embarrassed now. I embarrassed him. But he's back. He's been better now. So today we are talking about a crazy case I was reading into, and I'm not going to give too much away, but it is quite the plot twist at the end. So without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through this windshield into this plot twist case together. Eugene, or Gene Thurneau II, was by all accounts a man of warmth, dedication, and resilience. Born in Kansas City, Missouri, Gene grew up with solid Midwestern roots and later served his country as a member of the U.S. Air Force. And after a successful stint in the Air Force, he transitioned into a career as an air traffic controller. Very stressful job. My grandpa used to do it for like 30 years. Hats off to the people in air traffic control if you're listening to this by chance. But this is where his natural charisma quickly made him popular among colleagues. And at the Columbus Municipal Airport in Nebraska, one of his early postings, Gene's friendly, outgoing nature stood out. And he was described as extroverted and friendly, always ready to strike up a conversation. The opposite of me. Just kidding, I'll talk to anybody, really. It'll just kind of segue into a conversation of just deep-rooted trauma, and we trauma bond, and it just goes south really fast. But anyway, Gene was the kind of guy that had an easy smile and a kind word for everyone he met. And outside of work, he led a humble life, doting on his 3 pet dachshunds that he affectionately considered his family. Rupert, you hear that? Rupert's a dachshund, by the way. Rupert, you're a dachshund. Aww. But those who knew Gene paint a picture of a good-looking man who was trim, personable, and full of hope for the future. And he had a big heart and an optimistic outlook, which drew people into him. Yet behind Gene's warm demeanor lay the scars of past hurt. As by his mid-40s, Gene had already weathered a devastating personal heartbreak. He had actually been married for 20 years to his first wife, a relationship that had tested the limits of his devotion. Because when his wife fell gravely ill, Gene became her steadfast caretaker, nursing her through a life-threatening illness over a period of years. I can't even imagine. It's just like the most selfless, caring person ever, and to have that happen to your partner, it's just devastating. But he put everything on hold to ensure that she survived, demonstrating a depth of loyalty and compassion that speaks to his character. However, once she recovered her health, Gene's world was upended. And in a cruel twist, she told him she didn't want to be with him anymore, and she was leaving him for an old flame from her past. Like, what a blow to spend years and years taking care of your partner, all for them to get better and turn around and just leave you. I mean, obviously he deserves better, but oh man, it's so sad. It is so incredibly sad. So this revelation shattered Gene, obviously. And after years of pouring his love and energy into saving her life, he was rewarded not with gratitude, but with abandonment. And this betrayal left him heartbroken and just reeling, struggling to make sense of how everything had fallen apart. So struggling from the end of his 2-decade marriage, Gene did what many do after traumatic loss, and he just sought a fresh start. And in the aftermath of the divorce, work became Gene's refuge. He just poured himself into work. So he threw himself into his duties at the Nebraska control tower, logging long hours to occupy his mind. And despite his personal turmoil, Gene remained good at his job, calm under pressure, meticulous, and well-liked by his team. And not to mention, for air traffic control, it is quite literally one of the most stressful jobs in the world. Like, on top of being a doctor and like a police officer and everything, that you need a level head beyond a level head. So for him to have all of that devastation happen to him, and then just to go back to work and be super cool headed is just says a lot about him. But even keeping a cool head at work, a lot of those close to him could see the pain he carried beneath his friendly exterior. The wounds from his wife's betrayal ran deep, and reminders of his old wife were everywhere in Nebraska. So he knew he needed a change of scenery to truly move on. So in 2002, Gene made a pivotal decision, and he requested a transfer to Florida, where many of his immediate family, including his parents and siblings, had relocated. And he believed that being closer to family would help him heal, which, yeah, I mean, I'd do the same thing. So Florida just represented hope to Gene, a warm, sunny new beginning far away from the ghosts of his past. So when he announced his transfer plans at work, his colleagues were very supportive, knowing how much he'd been through, and they could understand his desire to start anew. But one coworker in particular, however, took the news harder than the rest. And this person was a quiet man who worked in the next cubicle, who seemed oddly emotional when Gene broke the news. And at the time, Gene interpreted the tears welling in his coworker's eyes as simple sadness at losing a colleague and a friend. And he didn't think much more after that. So the move was not just about escaping bad memories, it was about finding himself again. And in the wake of his divorce, Gene hadn't given up on the idea of love altogether. Deep down, he still hoped that one day he might meet someone new and rebuild the happy life that had been taken from him. So as he prepared for Florida, he dared to imagine a brighter future. So at 47 years old, Gene was determined that his story wasn't over, and he would make Florida the setting of his next chapter, one filled with family, friendship, and maybe even new love. So in early 2003, Gene's new chapter began in earnest, and he arrived in the Tampa Bay area of Florida to take up his post at the St. Petersburg Clearwater International Airport, a mid-sized airport where he would work as an air traffic controller. So as he settled into his new environment, he felt a cautious optimism, and the subtropical warmth embraced him, and knowing his family was only a short drive away gave him some sort of comfort. Because at the end of the day, this was a second chance, a new lease on life. It was a chance to rebuild his life from the ground up. And Gene's reputation as a skilled controller and a friendly presence quickly followed him to Florida. And his natural charm won over his new colleagues almost immediately. So it wasn't long before he felt a home in the new facility. So surrounded by loved ones, Gene started to regain the confidence and happiness he had lost. So Gene was in a good place in life, finally. And luckily, Florida didn't just bring Gene closer to his blood relatives. It also led him straight to the woman who would capture his heart. And not long after transferring to the new airport, Gene met Juanita, or JJ, Formoso. And JJ was a vivacious 48-year-old air traffic controller who worked alongside him. And JJ was a Florida native and a mother, known among coworkers as a confident, skilled professional who could handle the high-pressure environment of the control room with ease. And like Gene, JJ had her own painful history, because she was also going through a difficult divorce after about 20 years of marriage herself. So perhaps it was this shared experience of heartbreak that drew them together. Or maybe it was simply their natural chemistry. But in any case, sparks flew from the moment JJ and Gene met. And JJ certainly noticed Gene early on. And by all accounts, she was quite taken with him. The handsome new guy with a ready smile and kind eyes. At first, their interactions were the friendly, professional kind, and then Gene, still cautious from his previous hurt, took things slowly, just like the ultimate gentleman. He wasn't really the type to rush into another relationship, especially at work. But as weeks turned into months, the connection between Gene and JJ deepened, and they'd chat about work, then about life outside of work. Coffee dates became a regular thing, a highlight of both their days, but Gene and JJ kept it discreet. And for 2 whole years, they quietly nurtured their budding romance in private, not wanting to complicate their jobs with personal drama. Just the utmost professionalism. But it would be Gene who would finally muster the courage to take it to the next step. And one evening, after 2 happy years of dating under the radar, Jean proposed marriage to JJ. And by then, he knew without a doubt that she was the partner he wanted to spend the rest of his life with. And her answer was an enthusiastic yes. And when the couple shared the news of their engagement at work, the control room erupted in spontaneous applause, and their coworkers were genuinely happy for them, having sensed that there was something special between Jean and JJ. Your coworkers always know. They always know the tea, what's going on. And Jean just simply felt grateful to have the support of his colleagues as he and JJ embarked on a new journey together. So with the wedding on the horizon and their love solidified, Jean and JJ decided it was time to lay down roots in a place that they could call their own. And even before they officially tied the knot, the couple agreed that they wanted to build a home together, literally from the ground up. And they dreamed of a place tailored to their tastes, where they could start fresh and leave past sorrows behind. So wasting no time, they pooled their resources and purchased a spacious lot in an upscale gated community in Land O'Lakes, Florida, about 15 miles from North Tampa. And the neighborhood was quiet, secure, and picturesque, the perfect setting for the future. And soon, architects and contractors had blueprints drawn up, and construction on their custom dream home commenced. And before the house was completed, Jean and JJ made their commitment official, and they engaged vows in a small, intimate wedding ceremony attended only by family and their closest friends. And Jean's face was full of happiness as he watched JJ walk down the aisle, because after everything that he had endured, here was finally a moment of pure joy. So as the months rolled on, construction on their home neared completion. But little did they know that someone else had been imagining that life as well, watching their dream home rise brick by brick with very different emotions. And for now, Jean and JJ were simply happy, looking forward to settling into married life. And they had no inkling that their happily ever after was already under quiet threat from the shadows of obsession lurking in the background. So back when Jean was in Nebraska, there was another air traffic controller by the name of Robert Dean, or Bob Peterson. And Bob was the same age as Jean. Both men were in their late 40s at the time. But aside from that coincidence, he seemed at first glance to be Jean's polar opposite. Physically, Bob Peterson was overweight and balding, with a rounded build and unassuming presence. Where Jean was fit and traditionally handsome, Bob had the look of a middle-aged man who perhaps spent more time with stamps and books than at the gym. And I say that because Bob enjoyed stamp collecting as a hobby. Not saying that all people that collect stamps look like Bob, I'm just saying that he literally collected stamps. And socially, the two could not have been more different. Jean, as we know, was chatty and outgoing, while Bob was quiet, introverted, and somewhat reclusive. So in the bustle of the control tower, Bob tended to keep his head down and focus strictly on work. And he wasn't disliked by any means, and colleagues found him polite and competent, but he just didn't mingle much. He was basically the kind of person who could fade into the background really easily, the definition of a wallflower. He was said to be called Boring Bob by some colleagues, that's rough. But this was due to his mild and unremarkable demeanor. But despite being well-educated, he lacked the easy confidence that Jean exuded. So Bob largely kept to himself, offering only a few words here and there beyond necessary job-related talk. And the tower staff accepted Bob as he was, a harmless, unobtrusive presence who did his job and then went home. And that was that. So if anything, a few coworkers felt a bit sorry for Bob. He didn't fit in easily, and he was solitary by nature, but still, people knew very little about his personal life, as he rarely volunteered information about himself. Because Bob didn't share stories or jokes the way Jean did. And if he smiled, it was unusually in response to something Jean said, as if Bob looked to Jean for cues on how to act, in like a psychopathic way. When you see in movies when psychopaths are practicing how to smile and use emotions in the mirror, that's how I picture Bob was. So in many ways, Bob was an enigma to his colleagues, a seemingly ordinary, even dull man whose inner thoughts remained largely closed off to those around him. And it might have stayed that way with Jean, the sociable star, and Bob, the quiet loner, if not for Jean's own kindness and natural friendliness. Because Jean and Bob actually had cubicles right next to each other, and noticing that Bob was often alone, Jean made a point to befriend him, because that's just the kind of guy Jean was. He was just a very sweet man. And he would invite Bob into casual conversations, ask him how his day was going, and share little bits about his own life to make Bob feel included. And Bob, who often seemed hesitant to initiate anything, responded eagerly when Gene extended a hand of friendship. And soon, Bob began talking more, but mostly just to Gene. So it was as if Bob latched onto Gene as his one true friend in the workplace, the person he felt most comfortable around. And Gene didn't mind at all. He was happy to have a friendly rapport with a man that worked right next to him in the office. So one afternoon, Gene was showing off a few photos to colleagues, snapshots of his 3 beloved dachshunds at home, because his little dogs were like kids, which I totally get. And Bob would peer over at the pictures with interest. And when Gene proudly declared the breed, Bob responded with enthusiasm, "Oh, I love that breed." And Gene was pleased, thinking they'd found common ground as dog lovers. But in reality, Bob had no pets at all at the time. But Bob's eagerness to please Gene was such that he'd say anything to make a connection. And in a bizarre turn, Bob later went out and purchased a dog of the exact breed as Gene's dachshunds. So it was as if he was trying to mirror Gene's life in every detail, even down to the choice of pet. Which is, it's odd. Right now, it seems like, when you're on that like first or second date and they're like, yeah, I love watching football. And you're like, so do I. And they're like, what's your favorite team? And you're like, what's your favorite team? And they're just like the 49ers. And then you're just like, yeah, same. And they're like, who's your favorite player? And you're just like, I'm just going to go home and do some research really quick, get a few jerseys. And then you just get run down that hole. You barrel down that hill. We've all done it. Maybe not to that degree of like getting a dog in the same breed, but you're just like, oh yeah, that's great. I suggest you don't, because it just leads to bad stuff, as we're about to see. So Gene, of course, didn't realize Bob's "I love that breed" comment was disingenuous. He simply found it nice that Bob shared an interest in dogs. And it was photos like this that he once showed Bob Peterson, trying to be friendly and include his quieter colleague. So over time, Gene and Bob settled into a routine of pleasant workplace interaction. So they'd chat in between directing aircraft, sometimes grabbing a cup of coffee together during breaks. And Gene's affable nature drew Bob out of his shell a little more each day. And in those chats, Bob often flattered Gene or expressed interest in whatever Gene was interested in. Gene would buy a new pickup truck, and Bob would pepper him with questions about the make and the model. In fact, Bob actually went and bought the exact same make and color of the truck that Gene had purchased. Red flag number 2. So Gene shows up pictures of his dog. Bob ends up with the dogs. And at the time, these might have seemed like quirky coincidences or just Bob trying to fit in. And Gene even found some of it flattering, because he just thought Bob looked up to him as a role model of sorts, and because Bob lacked close friends of his own.
Quote, Bob was far more chatty with Gene. In fact, he appeared to be in awe of him,
one account would later note. So this dynamic just kind of defined their friendship. And it's important to note that Bob Peterson wasn't viewed as dangerous or creepy by anyone in those early days. He was a little odd, perhaps, but harmless otherwise. Coworkers just saw him as a lonely guy who was lucky to have a friend like Gene looking out for him. And Gene himself had a compassionate soft spot for Bob, because as extroverted as Gene was, he understood that not everyone fit in so easily. And he likely thought, Bob's a good guy and just shy, and took pride in helping Bob feel included. So the friendship seemed genuine and mutually beneficial. Gene provided camaraderie and Bob provided loyalty. But when Gene left Nebraska for Florida, he thought he was leaving his old life and everyone in it behind. And that's why it caught him by surprise a few months later when Bob Peterson showed up in Florida too. Let's take a little break because I want to tell you about a product that I've been using for the past few months and have been loving, and that is Blissy. Thank you to Blissy for supporting this channel and sponsoring this video. And before you think, oh, it's just another silk pillowcase, there's nothing special about it. Also, I don't know why you're English in this, but you are. This isn't like those cheap satin ones that are made from synthetics and are actually rough on your hair and skin. Blissy's real silk look is dermatologist tested and recommended. And here's what's most important to me. It's clinically proven to not clog pores, unlike cotton. And I have really sensitive skin, so that is very detrimental for me. And the science behind it is actually fascinating, because silk has naturally hydrating fibers that keep your skin moisturized all night. And it's antibacterial, hypoallergenic, and naturally cooling. We all love a cool pillow. So no more waking up with those weird sleep creases on your face or that sweaty, uncomfortable feeling. And plus, it eliminates frizz and preserves hairstyles and protects color-treated hair. And they've also got over 70 colors, including a new Wicked and Harry Potter line. The millennials are screaming right now, and yes, I am one of them. And over 3 million people have bought these, and they were even voted Best Gift of the Year 2024. And I've been using mine for around 3 months now, and honestly, my morning hair situation has gone from Garth from Wayne's World to Amy Dunn from Gone Girl. Say what you want about her, but she's got great hair. Not to mention, my skin feels softer, and those little lines around my eyes seem a little less noticeable, which I will take. And plus, all around, I'm just sleeping better because there's just something about a cool pillowcase that is lovely. And because you're a listener, Blissy is offering 60 nights risk-free plus an additional 30% off when you shop at blissy.com/CCCM. That's BLISSY.com/CCCM and use code CCCM to get an additional 30% off. And trust me, your skin and your hair will thank you. Thank you so much to Blissy for supporting this channel and sponsoring this video, and let's get back to the video. So in early 2003, roughly 3 months after Jean's transfer, Bob appeared in the doorway of the St. Pete Clearwater Control Tower office, smiling broadly at Jean. So Bob had managed to secure a transfer to the same facility as Jean, and the timing was uncanny. The dogs in the truck aren't seeming so innocent at this point, because Bob had left Nebraska and followed Jean to the very same corner of Florida. So was this just a really weird coincidence? Well, Bob had an explanation ready, and he claimed he too wanted a fresh start, and Florida sounded appealing. Plus, there were job openings there, and he acted like it was just a fortunate outcome that he and Jean ended up at the same place again. And Jean's feelings were mixed about this, because on one hand, he greeted Bob warmly. He's a nice guy and was probably touched that a friend from Nebraska valued him enough to come to the same workplace, and he likely felt flattered and happy not to lose that friendship. But on the other hand, in the back of his mind, Jean found the situation a bit odd and unsettling, and the thought may have crossed his mind. Was Bob essentially following me? After all, what were the odds that Bob would independently decide to move to Florida mere months after Jean did? However, Jean wasn't the type to jump to negative conclusions about people. And Bob said he wanted a new beginning too, Jean was inclined to believe him. Because again, he had no reason to believe that he was under any sort of threat. It's just Bob. It's just odd Bob, boring Bob. And Bob even framed it as wanting to start over just like Jean had. So Jean brushed aside the slight unease, and he probably thought, poor Bob doesn't have much tying him to Nebraska, so why not Florida? And Bob also had no spouse or children, and his brothers and family were scattered elsewhere, so relocating was very feasible for him as well. So Bob's integration into the Florida team was again low-key. He resumed his quiet, efficient work style as if nothing had changed except the weather. And for Jean, however, the odd coincidence of Bob's migration planted the first seed of concern, because Bob's sudden appearance made him a little uneasy. And Jean couldn't quite put his finger on why, but it felt as if a shadow from his old life had followed him into the new one. But still, Jean chose to see the good. And if Bob was coming all this way with no friends or family around, well, Jean would be a friend to him now. Because why wouldn't he be? But still, this odd timing of Bob's transfer, which no one really questioned, would later be recognized as one of the many red flags that something was amiss. So as the months went by, a series of strange coincidences and patterns began to emerge in Bob Peterson's behavior. Patterns that were noticed, but not fully understood at the time, by Jean and JJ specifically. And one of the earliest odd incidences happened when Jean and JJ were preparing to move into their new dream home. And both Jean and JJ had put their existing houses on the market because each of them owned a home before marrying each other. And to the couple's surprise, Bob expressed interest in buying Jean's old house as soon as he learned it was for sale. Third, fifth, sixth, eighth red flag? And on the surface, it might seem convenient, I guess. I don't even think it looks convenient. I just think it looks creepy at this point. But, it could be a friend wants to buy your place, saving you the hassle of listing it, I guess. So Jean was open to the idea and entertained Bob's offer. But then Bob made a strange request, and he wanted Jean's linens. Specifically, Jean's bed sheets and pillowcases to be included as part of the home purchase. Red flag number 52. I think that adds about 30 red flags. That's weird and creepy, and he's going to do weird shit with your sheets. But how not inconspicuous can you be, So when Jean first heard this, he likely chuckled, thinking Bob was joking, but Bob was dead serious. He wanted those very sheets Jean slept on. But why on earth would Bob need Jean's personal linens? It was an extremely intimate, odd thing to ask for. And I think I know exactly why, but I'm not going to talk about it, and you can use your own brain for that. But the house sale itself did go through, but the linens and pillowcases were not included, and Bob did not hide his disappointment. And perhaps Jean rationalized the linen episode as just Bob's social clumsiness or eccentric taste, I guess. But red flags were literally everywhere. But I guess at the time they were scattered and small enough to ignore or explain away. We can see it because we're reading through the whole story, but scattered out over, years at a time, I get why it's just like, Bob's just like that. So Jean and JJ found Bob's behavior weird, but not overtly threatening. He was just always there, always interested, and always watching. In an era before stalking was a common workplace topic, Jean mostly interpreted Bob's mimicry as awkward hero worship. But JJ felt something was off. But likely, she never imagined the depth of Bob's obsession. And they would soon find out, in the most horrific way, just how dangerously fixated Bob Peterson had become with Jean. So by the fall of 2006, Jean and JJ Thurneau were on the cusp of a perfect life they had fought hard to build. Their new custom home was finally complete, and they moved in amid a flurry of joy and relief. And the house was everything they'd hoped for. Every corner of the home represented a fresh start, and this place was truly their own, untainted by past memories. And as newlyweds, this was a thrilling time for them. And after settling in, Bob repeatedly insisted on visiting them at their home. And his persistence verged on pestering. Quote,
"I have a special housewarming gift for you,"
unquote. Bob would say repeatedly, implying that he couldn't simply hand it over at the office. And this reminds me of the movie The Gift, which now I'm curious if the movie is based off of this event. I need to look into that after. But The Gift, also a very good movie with Jason Bateman. Is that right? This guy. You should watch it. Anyway, but the gift had been given at the house. And Jean wondered privately why Bob was making such a fuss. Why couldn't he just give it to them at work as if it's a normal gift? But Bob was insistent that they'd, quote,
understand when they saw it,
unquote, why it needed to be at their home. And Jean and JJ felt a growing sense of obligation because he was a coworker they did see every single day because both of them worked at the same job as Bob. And Bob had gone out of his way for their wedding gift even though they hadn't invited him to the wedding. And the gift was an expensive Swarovski crystal vase. And this gift was unexpected and very lavish, far beyond what most coworkers would give. And Jean and JJ were a bit uncomfortable with it, but also touched by Bob's gesture. In fact, they felt a twinge of guilt for not inviting him when they saw how much trouble and expense Bob had gone into picking out the crystal vase. And Bob's intention, it appeared, was to ensure they did feel guilty after he felt upset for the lack of invitation. And in that, he succeeded. Jean couldn't shake a mild sense of obligation toward Bob after that, resolving to be even kinder to his lonely colleague. So now, to refuse him a one-time dinner visit might seem rude or ungrateful, though a quiet voice in the back of their minds told them they'd prefer not to let Bob deeper into their personal lives, and they ultimately decided it would do more harm than good to alienate him at this point. Quote,
"What's the worst that could happen?"
unquote, they likely said to each other, with A shrug. It'll just be one awkward dinner, and then we can get on with our lives. So they agreed to invite Bob over for one evening for dinner and to see their new home. This is like the movie The Gift. And I researched it. It says it's not based off of this, and it's based off of like Cape Fear and Fatal Attraction and stuff, but there's like no way that they didn't take stuff from this case, like at all. I need to rewatch that movie now. So obviously Bob was elated when Jean extended the invitation, eagerly locking down the date and time. So the night finally came for Bob's visit, and it would be a night that started innocently enough, but ended in unimaginable horror. So it was November 1st, 2006, a Wednesday, and Jean and JJ planned a simple dinner at home with Bob as their guest. And perhaps they chose a weeknight hoping to keep it low-key and short, like it wouldn't run too late because they had to wake up the next morning to go to work. And they even had plans to go out later that evening, or so they hinted to Bob, to ensure the dinner wouldn't stretch on indefinitely. So the couple braced themselves for an evening with their socially awkward friend. So Bob Peterson arrived earlier than expected that evening. In fact, he showed up on their doorstep before Jean and JJ had finished some last-minute preparations. And it wasn't a huge issue, as his early arrival meant they would be able to get him out of their house at a more reasonable hour, because they didn't want him to stay long, and initially, the dinner proceeded normally as any dinner would. But he had no problem indulging in the food. If there was one thing Bob did that night with enthusiasm, it was eat. So as he finished his plate and they thought he could leave soon, he insisted on more food. It was like the only thing that could keep him in the house, so he just kept eating and eating and eating, which I don't know why, but it's like terrifying. Just like you're kind of held captive in your own home by a guest who you can't let leave because they keep eating, and it's like such an awkward situation, but like, what else are you supposed to do? So they obliged Bob's appetite, but each passing minute made it clearer Bob had no intention of leaving anytime soon. And it was getting later than they anticipated, and their hints about having plans later didn't seem to register with Bob. So Jean and JJ exchanged secretive glances. Like, how do we get him to leave? But Bob was not budging. And finally, perhaps sensing their impatience, or maybe simply remembering his own agenda, Bob perked up and said,
I almost forgot about the housewarming gift I have for you.
So he would reach down and pull out a beautifully crafted leather-bound photo album out of his bag. And on the cover, embossed in gold, with the name Thurneau, Jean and JJ were immediately intrigued. And it was a thoughtful and personalized gesture, so they would thank him as they opened the album together. And what they saw in the album made their smiles fade into expressions of shock, because page after page contained large, glossy photographs of their house under construction. And the very first image was their lot when it was just dirt, before building began. And the next showed early foundation work, then framing, then the roof going up. And as they turned each page, the house in the photos gradually materialized until the final pages showed the fully completed exterior. So they were looking at a chronological photo documentary of their home's entire construction process. And JJ's mouth hung open, and she and Jean shared a bewildered and disturbed look with each other, and said,
You've been at our house watching it being built?
JJ finally asked, incredulous at the implication, and Bob beamed with an odd sort of pride, saying,
Every couple of days.
Oh my God! Red flag number 3000. And he would just reply very matter-of-factly, like, yeah, what's wrong with that? You're welcome. Pfft, ungrateful bitch. And he would then add, almost if it excused the horrifying intrusion,
I've photographed everyone's houses from work.
What? Call the police! And he just seemed oblivious to just how creepy the revelation was. And for months, without their knowledge, Bob had been sneaking onto their property to take pictures, tracking every stage of their building of their private sanctuary. And Jean and JJ were just sitting there like stunned, because this went far beyond normal friendship. They now realized Bob's obsession with their life was much more intense than they had thought. And JJ herself felt just violated, which rightfully so, Because those pictures, though beautifully shot, I guess, represented a breach of privacy in a place they thought was their safe haven. So an uncomfortable silence would fill the room. And JJ especially felt the need to get Bob out of their house as soon as possible. But before she could muster a tactful way to usher him out, fate intervened in a small but significant way. Because as the tension mounted in the living room, headlights swept across the window as someone pulled into the driveway. And a moment later, there was a sound of a car door and a knock at the door. And it was JJ's adult daughter arriving to fetch her mother for a quick errand run they had planned earlier. And the daughter was expecting JJ to accompany her to pick up a few items that evening. And JJ obviously saw this as an opportunity. And she immediately told Jean and Bob that she had to go out briefly with her daughter. And perhaps she hoped Bob would take it as a cue to leave as well. But Bob, however, didn't budge. And instead, he remained in his seat. So now, alone with Jean, as JJ left the house, she cast one last glance over her shoulder at her husband and their odd guest, hoping that by the time she returned, Bob would have made his exit. So as JJ stepped out with her daughter, the atmosphere in the Thurneau home was thick with tension. Jean and Bob were now alone in the living room, and the album of clandestine photographs resting on the coffee table like an elephant in the room. And one can imagine Jean was trying to keep the situation as polite as possible, and perhaps he stood up to clear the dinner plates or offered something to drink. Anything to diffuse the utter awkwardness between himself and Bob. But Bob's mind was on something entirely different, because he hadn't just come to hand over the photo album, he had another gift waiting. One far more personal and disturbing than even the albums of stolen moments. So moments after JJ's car pulled away, Bob made his move and said,
"I have another gift for you."
But before Jean could respond, Bob hurried out to his car parked in the driveway, and he returned carrying something in his hand. And as Bob approached, Jean might have felt his stomach nodding. And the bizarre photo album was bad enough, so what on earth could this second gift be? And Bob would come through the door and hand the gift to Jean. And it was a 3-page letter addressed to Jean, which Bob had prepared in advance. And Jean began to read it. And with each sentence, his blood ran colder. Because in this letter, Bob Peterson poured out the secret feelings he had been harboring for years, saying, quote,
"I have loved you for some time now,"
unquote. And he described how he had always, quote unquote, chickened out when trying to tell Jean face to face. So at this moment, while Jean's reading this letter, everything is just clicking into place in the most horrifying way. Bob following him to Florida, buying his house, copying his interests, photographing the new home. It all stemmed from this twisted, unrequited love and obsession. And what exactly transpired in the Thurneau living room immediately after Jean finished reading Bob's shocking letter can only be reconstructed from evidence and later speculation, since there were no witnesses. But the sequence of events would turn deadly within minutes. So JJ would return to what she expected would be a quiet home. But instead, she stepped into a scene of confusion and dread, because Bob's vehicle was no longer there. And she likely assumed Bob had finally taken the hint and just gone home. However, she noticed a trail of blood droplets and smears in the driveway and up the front steps. So puzzled and alarmed, she followed the trail, which led to the front door. And the door itself was closed but unlocked. And JJ's stomach tightened, because Jean never would have left blood on the porch without cleaning it. And where was Bob? So she pushed open the door, calling her husband's name. There was no answer, and the house was unsettlingly quiet. So as she took a few steps inside, the sight that greeted her made her heart skip, because she found more blood smeared on the floor in a long line leading further in. So these looked like drag marks, as if something or someone heavy had been pulled through the foyer. And JJ tried to calm herself with rational thoughts. Maybe Jean had an accident and Bob took him to the hospital. Or perhaps Jean cut himself badly and was dragged out for help. But if so, why was there still so much blood left behind? And just inside the living area, JJ's eyes were drawn to a pile of clothing on the floor, and she recognized them immediately because it was a man's t-shirt, jeans, and underwear. And they were Jean's clothes, and they were soaked in blood, crumpled in a heap as if discarded hastily. So now panic was rising in her chest, and this just made no sense. And Jean was nowhere to be seen, and neither was Bob. So her mind must have raced with every single terrifying possibility. And just fighting the urge to break down, JJ moved further into the living room, and her dream home had become a blood-spattered mystery. The Christmas tree they had happily put up that afternoon and now stood over a ghastly scene. And she picked up her phone to try and call Jean, only to hear something from within the room. And that was Jean's cell phone. And it was ringing faintly from within his pocket of his discarded jeans. So seeing Jean's phone abandoned amidst his bloody clothes, it's just sent a jolt of reality through JJ, because something violent had occurred here, and at the moment, any hope that this was a trivial accident just completely evaporated. And she realized with horror that Jean and Bob were both missing under deeply suspicious circumstances, because the blood indicated that someone was seriously hurt. So JJ would cautiously continue to look around, calling out for Jean in hopes he might somehow be there and in need of aid. But still, she was met with silence and no answer, and the house was empty, and something told JJ that Bob was not helping Jean. Bob was the danger. And her intuition flashed back to Bob's bizarre behavior with the photo album earlier that evening, and a chill ran through her spine. And in a matter of minutes, the person she had considered a harmless, if awkward colleague had become the prime suspect in her husband's disappearance. So as JJ moved through the living room, she stumbled upon a spent bullet casing on the floor near the couch, and the small metal shell glinted in the light. And it was a .22 caliber casing, as experts would later determine. Which means a gun was fired in the home. So her reality was undeniable now. She was standing in a crime scene. And all signs pointed to an attack right here in their home. So trying to keep her composure, JJ immediately dialed 911, and Pasco County Sheriff's deputies were dispatched at once. And overwhelmed, JJ could only imagine the worst. Jean had likely been shot and forcibly taken by Bob, and it was a thought almost too terrible to process. But all evidence was aligning with it. And JJ's eyes would land on one more thing that she hadn't noticed in her initial sweep. And she realized this must be what started the violence. And it was the 3-page letter Bob had given Jean. And her hands would tremble as she picked it up and began to read Bob's words for herself. And nothing could have prepared JJ for the vile content of Bob Peterson's letter. And as she read Bob's written confession, her revulsion grew with every word. Because here was Bob, a man she mostly knew as a quiet coworker who sometimes made her uneasy, laying bare an obsession she never dreamed he had. And Bob wrote that he felt he had been living a lie all these years by hiding his feelings for Jean. And he mused about his sexuality, admitting uncertainty about being gay, but certainty about being in love with Jean. And the letter described in disturbingly explicit terms Bob's longing for Jean, something that made JJ's skin crawl. But detailed fantasies and desires, including the jaw-dropping admission that he envied JJ because, quote,
she gets to touch and see Jean's naked body every day,
unquote. JJ likely felt disgust and anger at the line Bob was jealous of not only Jean's affection, but physical intimacy that was meant to be private. And then came the most horrifying part, Bob's threatening ultimatum. And he wrote, and likely spoke to Jean, that, quote,
he would not leave the house until they had
relations with each other. Adult things with each other. And Bob explicitly propositioned Jean for, stuff that you do with your mouth downstairs. I guess I could say that. Saying, quote, unquote,
I'm not leaving until I taste your good in my...
And this is a line that JJ would never forget. And her heart broke and her stomach turned as she pictured how Jean must have reacted and the shock and betrayal he would have felt reading this from someone he considered a friend. And Bob's tone in the letter went back and forth between pleading confession and menacing demand. And it even included a twisted facade of religious remorse, saying, quote unquote, "I have already asked for God's forgiveness," as if that absolved what he was about to do, which it didn't. It's evil. So clutching this letter, JJ burst into tears. And by the time deputies arrived and gently took it from her hands as evidence, she had seen enough to assemble the grim scenario in her mind. Bob had come out to Jean, been rejected, and snapped. And she could only imagine Jean's revulsion and anger at Bob's proposition and how that encounter turned violent, saying, quote, "I'm sure Bob's feelings were extremely hurt. Jean would not hold back on how he felt about that," unquote. JJ would later reflect, recognizing that her husband would have been upfront in rejecting Bob's advances. And it was an unimaginable situation, because her kind, loving husband was confronted by a deluded friend's ultimatum. And JJ thought of Jean's likely last moments, and how horrified and in danger he must have felt, and how she wasn't there to help. So this tormenting thought would haunt her forever. And as police took stock of the scene, they too read Bob's letter and immediately understood the significance. Because here was essentially a written confession and motive left behind by the likely perpetrator. And it just shed light on why Bob Peterson might have harmed Jean, an all-assuming, unreciprocated love that tipped over into violence when rebuffed. And Pasco County Sheriff's spokesman, Kevin Dahl, later summarized the predicament saying, quote, "It's hard to tell what happened there after he gave him the note. We just know what the aftermath was," unquote. And the note provided context, but not the exact sequence of crime. And officers assured JJ that they would do everything possible to find Jean and Bob. And an alert went out to patrol units to be on the lookout for Bob Peterson's vehicle and both men, who were officially listed as missing persons. And one possibly a victim of abduction, obviously, and the other a dangerous suspect. So for JJ, those next hours were complete agony. And her home, which earlier that day rang with laughter and domestic happiness, was now cordoned off with crime scene tape stained with her husband's blood. And she could barely process the surreal horror. Bob Peterson, of all people, had kidnapped her husband at gunpoint after attempting to force a sexual encounter. So the plot twist of reality felt like something out of a nightmare or crime thriller. And in the chaos of emotion, one thought gave JJ a glimmer of desperate hope. Jean might still be alive. And if Bob took him, maybe he only wounded him and was holding him somewhere. That was the only thing she could really hold on to at that point. And maybe Jean could still be rescued if they found Bob in time. So clinging to that possibility, she prayed silently, even as she answered investigators' questions through sobs. So the stage was now set for a frantic 2-day search, as authorities raced against the clock to locate Bob Peterson and unravel the deadly drama that began with a love letter. So the Pasco County Sheriff's Office launched into action on the night of November 1st, 2006. And given the bloody scene and Bob Peterson's ominous letter, the stakes were clear. Jean's life was in imminent danger if he was still alive, and Bob Peterson was armed and unstable and extremely dangerous. So police units scoured the immediate area around the Thurneau home for any signs of Bob's vehicle or the direction he might have gone. And inside the house, crime scene investigators collected the evidence, which was blood samples, Jean's discarded clothes, the shell casings, and Bob's letter. But obviously no signs of forced entry were found on the doors or windows, which made sense because Bob was an invited guest. And the implication was that Bob had likely pulled the gun on Jean while still inside, controlling him without needing a break-in. So as the night wore on into the early morning hours of November 2nd, no word came from either man, and Bob had not called anyone, as far as police could tell looking into his cell phone records, to claim responsibility, or to make any sort of demands. Nor had Jean managed to reach out for help either. So the silence only deepened the dread, and police began checking Bob Peterson's known addresses and contacts. And they learned quickly that Bob's listed address was Ellenton, Florida, a town about 30 miles south. So officers would go to Bob's Ellenton house, and they found no one home and no immediate signs of foul play there. It just appeared dark and undisturbed, as if Bob hadn't even been there recently. So this was a dead end, at least for the moment. And as the search stretched into its second day, the situation became more dire. And the Tampa Bay Times ran an initial piece titled, "Two Men Vanish, Leaving Blood Behind," detailing how Jean Thurneau and Robert Peterson were both missing, and that pool of blood and a mysterious note were found at the scene. And JJ, just distraught, likely huddled with family and clergy, because she was known to be a woman of faith and turned to her church for support during this time. Just every hour that passed with Jean still missing was torture. And she was haunted by thoughts of what might be happening to him. I can't even imagine the dread she had in her at every moment. And investigators, meanwhile, dug into Bob Peterson's background for clues. And they interviewed colleagues from the St. Pete Clearwater Tower, and that's when more pieces of the puzzle came to light. Because coworkers began mentioning how Bob had transferred shortly after Jean, and how he'd always seemed fixated on Jean at work. And suddenly, the full scope of Bob's obsession became clear to law enforcement. This was not a spur-of-the-moment crime of passion, but the climax of a long, simmering fixation. And they realized Bob had effectively been stalking Jean for years, first in Nebraska and now in Florida, and all while keeping his love secret until this tragic end. So armed with this understanding, police theorized that Bob might have prepared a remote location in advance as part of his final plan, because he'd been extensively planning for years at this point, so why wouldn't he have like an endgame plan? And a big break would come late on November 2nd or early November 3rd when detectives searching Bob's financial records and belongings uncovered a rental agreement for a property in Safety Harbor, Florida. And the lease seemed recent, and Bob had not mentioned renting a place to anyone. So this hidden residence immediately became the prime lead. And it fit the narrative of premeditation. Bob possibly rented a secluded place to take Jean where he wouldn't be interrupted, which is horrifying. So armed with this new lead, officers rushed to Safety Harbor. And by now, it was November 3rd, 2006, 2 days since Jean had disappeared, and the dread was at its peak. And JJ just waited by the phone, fearing the worst, but praying for some sort of miracle. And investigators would approach the Safety Harbor rental house, unsure of what they would find. Would Bob be there with Jean tied up? Would there be a standoff? They had to prepare for anything. So on that morning of November 3rd, law enforcement converged on the address of Bob Peterson's rented house. And the neighborhood likely had no idea what was unfolding as police quietly surrounded the entire location. And after knocking and getting no response, they made the decision to force entry into the home, concerned that lives could be in jeopardy inside. So they breached the door and swept in tactically. And almost immediately, officers were met with a scene of utter horror in the master bedroom. Because there, lying on the floor of the bedroom, they found the lifeless body of Jean Thurneau. And the sight was absolutely gruesome. Because Jean, like he had left his home, was unclothed, and it was immediately evident that he had suffered severe violence. And most shockingly and gruesomely, his had been removed in a very brutal way. And it was assumed that a razor blade or other sharp instrument was used. And I think it just shows the frustration that Bob had for probably being angry that Jean did not want to do what Bob wanted to do. So that was the retort, was mutilating Jean in his most intimate area. And Jean had also been shot in the head with a .22 caliber bullet, and blood had pooled and dried on the floor around him. And not far from Jean's body, on the bed, lay the corpse of Bob Peterson. And Bob was dressed only in a t-shirt and underwear, and a single gunshot visible on his head. And for investigators, the discovery answered the most pressing question, which was, where were Jean and Bob? But it brought a heavy finality. And both men were dead, meaning there would be no rescue, no negotiation, and no trial. And the case had reached its tragic conclusion just immediately. And when news of the discovery was relayed to JJ, it absolutely shattered her. And 2 days of holding on to hope collapsed into grief. And authorities likely delivered the news with solemn regret, with the way Jean's body had been found and that he was gone. And the brutality of what Bob did was a detail they might have initially shielded from her due to its extreme nature. But eventually, however, such facts became public as the case was discussed in media and in investigation discovery shows as well. But JJ herself said she spared some family members those details because they were too horrific to speak of. And the grim discovery made headlines, and local newspapers described how the 2-day mystery ended in tragedy. And reporters recounted how Jean's body was found beside Bob's, and that evidence indicated Bob shot Jean and then himself. And it was a story almost too shocking to believe. Just a tale of obsession, betrayal, and death that left the community absolutely reeling. And many who knew Bob casually were stunned that boring Bob was capable of such barbarity. And those close to Jean were just absolutely devastated that his hard-earned happy ending had been so violently snatched away. And the tragedy was now fully exposed, and all that remained was to understand how and why it happened, and for those left behind, especially JJ, to somehow pick up the pieces. So with the bodies recovered and evidence in hand, investigators formally concluded what the evidence had pointed to all along. This was a murder-suicide orchestrated by Robert Dean Peterson. And the Pasco County Sheriff's Office, in their statements, explained that all signs showed Bob had shot and killed Jean at the Thurneau home on November 1st, then transported Jean's body to the Safety Harbor house where Bob later died using the same firearm. But there was zero indication of any other persons being involved, and no forced entry, no unknown DNA, nothing to suggest a third-party assailant. And the .22 caliber handgun found by Bob's body was confirmed to be the weapon that fired the fatal bullets into Jean and Bob. And the mutilation of Jean's body, while not directly part of the cause of death, underscored the intensely personal and deranged nature of the entire crime. And the formal ruling meant that there would be no criminal trial, and that the only suspect was deceased, effectively closing the case. So for law enforcement, it was both a relief to have resolved the immediate danger and obvious frustration because Bob could never be interrogated or brought to justice in court. And the detective work pivoted to unraveling the backstory and motives before the record and to provide answers to Jean's family. And the tale that emerged is the one that you heard today, and it's just absolutely devastating and horrifying. And in the aftermath, as reporters and detectives dug deeper, a portrait of Bob Peterson's secret life emerged. And Bob's family, when contacted, shared revelations that even Jean's closest circle hadn't known. And Anthony Peterson, Bob's brother, spoke publicly, disclosing that Bob was gay and didn't really hide that fact within the family. And this was eye-opening, because Bob had never come out at work, but apparently his brother knew he was attracted to men. And Anthony also shared something very eerie, and that's that Bob often talked about Jean in conversations over the years. And Bob spoke of Jean so frequently that his brother knew the name, yet Bob never indicated that they had any relationship beyond friendship. So to Anthony, Bob's fixation on Jean was notable, but he had no idea it was dangerously obsessive. And after the fact, Anthony expressed shock at his brother's actions, saying, quote,
"I didn't even think he had a gun. I didn't think he was capable of doing it. He might have snapped," unquote.
So it seemed even Bob's own family hadn't grasped the depth of his obsession or the instability brewing within him. And Bob had no close friends outside of Jean, and even that friendship was very one-sided and based on Bob's infatuation. So investigators found that Bob had been essentially stalking Jean for years. And interviews with JJ in the aftermath highlighted how, in retrospect, so many warning signs were there. And she recounted to the Tampa Bay Times, enumerating Bob's bizarre behaviors. He followed Jean to Florida after a job transfer, bought the furnished home he owned, requested to have the sheets stay, gave him a secret photo collection of a home that he'd clearly been stalking that was their own. And each of these things alone seemed odd, but together they formed a clear picture of stalking. And JJ admitted that she had no idea about Bob's stalking until it was too late. And she did find Bob's behavior around Jean to be odd and told police so, but she never suspected the depth of his love or capacity for violence, saying, quote, "He never indicated that they had a relationship," unquote. And that would be Bob's brother. And that's true. Bob never openly tried anything until the very end. It was just all in his head, a fantasy he nurtured alone. And the investigation also debunked any early thought that maybe Jean had provoked Bob or had an affair or anything salacious, but absolutely nothing of the sort was true. Jean had never encouraged Bob's affections, and he likely never even knew about them until that very night. And this case forced some people to think about boundaries and warning signs in their own lives, and it became a cautionary tale about how obsession can hide in plain sight. And for law enforcement, there wasn't much more to do on the case legally, but they often reach out to victims' families in these scenarios to answer any lingering questions and make sure they understand the findings. And JJ, one can imagine, wanted to know every single detail, not out of a morbid curiosity, but just to piece together the how and why so she could find some sort of closure. But at the end of the day, she lost her beloved husband, the man who had given her a second chance at love, in the most violent way possible, and to someone they both had known and trusted. JJ's immediate response was not one of hatred or vengeance. Rather, she leaned on her deep well of faith and compassion to get through the ordeal. And in interviews, an astonishing statement from her revealed the grace with which she tried to cope, saying, quote, "I don't hate Bob. How can you hate someone who is mentally disturbed?" Unquote. And that was an extremely powerful sentiment, because after all the atrocities that Bob had done to the love of her life, JJ chose to view him through a lens of pity rather than pure anger, attributing his actions to severe psychological problem, which he clearly had. And ultimately, Jean Thurneau's story is remembered as a heartbreaking case of deadly obsession. But Jean's legacy, however, lives on in the memories of loved ones and in the cautionary tale his story has become. So through retellings like these, we honor Jean by learning from what happened to him. And we honor JJ's courage and compassion. And we face the dark truth that sometimes the real danger isn't a stranger at all, but a harmless friend whose love has turned into a lethal obsession. But my heart goes out to JJ and her family and to Jean's entire family. And with that, that is the case. If you would like me to dive into any other true crime cases, let me know down below. I always read the comments. And until then, stay safe, and I will see your beautiful face in the next video, okay? On August 31st, 2016, two people got in a car and drove to work, but they never came home. No goodbye, no warning, and no trace. Just two people here one moment and gone the next, leaving behind nothing but questions and a little dog with no food and no water. This is the terrifying disappearance of Kayla Brown and Charlie Carver. Crime, conspiracy, cults, serial killers, and murder. All things that I love to consume, and I know you do too, you sick, twisted, beautiful, intellectually minded freak. Now today we are talking about a very mysterious case, so without further ado, let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 to the highway, slam on the brakes, and bust through the windshield into this mysterious case together. You know that email from your dentist that says, "You're due for a cleaning"? Well, I've archived that same email for about 14 months, and I just have like a whole graveyard of healthcare emails I keep meaning to get to. You know, the weird mole on my back, I just am keeping an eye on. And at some point, the "I'll deal with it later" just started to become my personality trait. So this past year, I actually did the thing and I booked doctor's appointments with ZocDoc. And for those of you who don't know, ZocDoc is a free app and website that helps you find and book high-quality in-network doctors so you can find someone that you actually love. We're talking 150,000 providers in all 50 states with 200 plus specialties like dermatology, dental, primary care, you name it. And you could read thousands of verified patient reviews too and see real-time availability and click to book instantly. So you're not playing phone tag back and forth with the doctor's office, which is so annoying. And most appointments happen within 24 hours to 72 hours, and you can even get some same-day appointments. I know I have on several occasions. But I use ZocDoc, and I highly recommend that you do as well. So stop putting off those doctor's appointments and go to ZocDoc.com/CCCM to find and instantly book a doctor you love today. That's ZocDoc.com/CCCM. ZocDoc.com/CCCM. Thank you so much to ZocDoc for sponsoring the video and supporting the channel, and let's get back to it. Kayla Victoria Brown was born on November 17, 1985 in Anderson, South Carolina, a small city tucked into the northwest corner of the state, close enough to the Georgia line that people sometimes forget which Carolina they're in. And there were no headlines from her childhood, no stories that made the news. The world wasn't paying attention to Kayla Brown. Not yet. But her mother, Bobby Newsom, raised her there, and by her late 20s, Anderson was still home. And at 30 years old, Kayla stood 5'8" with reddish-brown hair and green eyes. And people who knew her described her as someone warm and someone very present. Now, Dan Heron knew the family well, and he dated Kayla's mother years earlier and stayed close to both of them. And he called Kayla a very close friend of mine. Now, she had a Pomeranian named Romeo, and that dog went everywhere with her. And if you asked anyone close to Kayla who mattered most in her life, it was Romeo, her dog. And her mother, Bobby, put it simply, saying, quote, "That dog is her baby," unquote. I can relate. I have 5 babies, and they're all dogs. But to make some extra money, Kayla picked up cleaning jobs on the side. And she'd been acquainted with a local real estate broker named Todd Kolep for years, connected through Facebook after she posted looking for extra work. Now, Kolep hired her a handful of times to clean houses tied to his listings. And she usually brought her boyfriend along with her to help. But the work was straightforward and the pay was decent. Overall, a pretty good gig. Now, Charles David Carver was born on November 19th, 1983 in Anderson, South Carolina, the same town as Kayla, 2 years and 2 days apart. And most people called him Charlie. And he was 5'11" with brown hair and blue eyes and about 180 pounds. And before settling into civilian life, he'd done time in the Army National Guard. And he'd also been an explorer cadet with the Anderson County Sheriff's Office. And by his early 30s, he'd settled into civilian work as a printing machine operator at a company called First Quality Tissue. But the job was just how he paid bills. And what Charlie loved was everything else. The man loved pool, he played in both 9-ball and 8-ball leagues around town, and he was a writer, and he was working on his 5th mystery novel. And his father, Chuck Carver, said about Charles, quote, "He never hurt anybody. He would give you the shirt off his back or the last $2 in his pocket. That was just the guy he was," unquote. And his mother, Joanne, saw it the same way, saying, quote, "He could bring a smile to the saddest person. He loved to laugh. He loved making people laugh," unquote. Now, Mackenzie Durham had known Charlie since high school, and even after the romance ended, the friendship held for 16 years. That was just the kind of person he was, the kind that people just held on to. So Kayla and Charlie started dating sometime in the spring of 2016. And by August, they were sharing an apartment in Anderson. And at this point, it had only been a few months. It happened fast, the way things sometimes do when two people just fit. And Charlie's situation wasn't uncomplicated, though, because his divorce from his wife, Nikki, hadn't been finalized yet. And on paper, he was still a married man. And Dan Heron saw it coming and didn't hold back, saying, quote, "I warned her. I said, Kayla, you're dealing with a married couple here," unquote. But Kayla and Charlie pushed forward anyway, and their friends could see this wasn't a fling. Marriage was already part of the conversation, and they'd only been a couple for around 4 or 5 months at this point, but both of them were very serious about it, and they were happy together. But they were also broke. Making ends meet was a constant struggle, so any chance they had to pick up extra work, they took. So on August 29th, 2016, a friend came by the apartment that evening, and the three of them sat down for dinner together. Just a normal night. And on August 30th, Kayla was still texting people back, and several friends heard from her that day, nothing unusual. But then came August 31st. That morning, Charlie clocked out of his shift at work, and he was caught on the building's surveillance feed heading out the door. But this would be the last time anyone saw him on camera. And after that, both of their phones went quiet, and the texts stopped, and so did the calls. Everything stopped. Now, Kayla and Charlie's day was pretty simple. Todd Kohlep, the real estate broker Kayla had cleaned houses for over years, had asked them to come out to a piece of property he owned near Woodruff, South Carolina, and their job was to clear brush. Now, Kayla did consider asking a different person to come, but she ended up just getting her boyfriend to come along with her, as he usually did on a lot of her jobs. So the two of them drove out together to a property that stretched across nearly 100 acres of woods and open land in rural Spartanburg County. The communities surrounding the property were places where people recognized each other at the grocery store and the football field. And Greenville news reporter Michael Burns described them as, quote, typical small southern towns, home to high school football and Sunday dinners after church, unquote. So Kayla Brown and Charlie Carver would do what they were supposed to do and go to their job. But this would be the day they would mysteriously go missing. Now, Joanne Shiflett, Charlie's mother, had a rule with her son. A day didn't pass where the two of them didn't talk in some way. A text, a call, something. Days of silence turned into a week, and Joanne picked up the phone and called the front office at the apartment complex where the couple lived, and she asked someone to go knock on their door. So the manager knocked, but no answer. And so she let herself in, and everything inside was untouched, and the place felt abandoned. But she did find one thing, and that was Romeo, Kayla's Pomeranian, and left behind with no food and no water. And Charlie's mother reported him missing on September 3rd. And 2 days later, a friend of Kayla's went to the police and filed her own missing persons report. And both cases would go through Anderson PD. And what investigators found inside the apartment only deepened the family's panic, because Kayla's glasses were still there, and her contact lenses were too, and also the medication she took regularly. And her car sat untouched in the parking lot. And the only thing unaccounted for was Charlie's car, a white 2002 Pontiac Grand Prix with the plate number HWY224. And the woman who managed Anderson Crossing told reporters Charlie had rented there going on 3 years. And when his rent was unpaid, she said that was a red flag. He never missed a payment. Charlie just didn't do that. So both families were certain of one thing: Kayla and Charlie hadn't left on their own. And the proof to them was the dog. Kayla wouldn't walk away from Romeo. That was not a possibility anyone who knew her would believe. But days would turn into weeks, and no one knew what to do. So the two mothers, Bobby and Joanne, went to the apartment together that weekend, and they would just box up every last thing their kids owned, and they would just move it into storage, waiting for a return that might not come. And Joanne tried to explain the weight of it to Dateline, saying, quote, "It's so much worse than you can think, not knowing. It's like you have a hot skillet and there are 2 drops of water you put on it, and they just disappear," unquote. And the community stepped in where the investigation stalled, and volunteers printed flyers and papered them across Anderson. And Facebook groups sprang up overnight, sharing the couple's photos, pushing the story further than local news could ever carry it. And Dateline picked up the case on October 10th, running the couple's story over a month later as part of the Missing in America series. But as the weeks dragged on, something strange started happening on Charlie's Facebook page. Posts kept appearing, more than 50 of them after the couple vanished, in fact. One entry slotted into July said Kayla was pregnant with a baby girl. And another in August said they closed on a home. Third, dated September 1st, announced a wedding. And photos were uploaded too, presented as if they were recent. And the family recognized them immediately. They'd been posted more than a year earlier. Joanne knew her son's voice. Whoever was writing those posts wasn't Charlie. At least that's what she thought. And then the content would start to turn dark, and the account started filling up with disturbing memes and violent imagery. One read, quote, "I weren't crazy, I'd be insane," unquote. And another said, quote, "Sometimes late at night, I dig a hole in the backyard to keep the nosy neighbors guessing," unquote. The family was adamant Charlie's account had been hijacked, but the damage was already done, and the stream posts gave some people a reason to believe the couple had simply walked away from their lives. It kind of muddied the urgency, and it created doubt where there should have been alarm, and it bought the person responsible for their disappearance exactly what he needed: time. And while someone was using Charlie's account to muddy the search, Todd Kohlmeck was posting on his own page, the guy who hired Kayla and Charlie multiple times. 2 weeks after the couple vanished, he wrote a post actually mocking missing persons cases, saying, quote, "People go missing all the time. They always turn up somewhere," unquote. And then he added a line about himself, saying, quote, "In the event I become missing, please note no one would take me. I eat too much and I am crabby," unquote. So who really was Todd Kohlmeck? Todd Christopher Samsell was born on March 7th, 1971 in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. And he was an only child, and his parents, Regina and William Samsell, split up when he was just 2 years old. And Regina won the custody battle, and a year later she married again. And by 1976, the new husband had legally adopted Todd. And that's how he became Todd Kohlmeck. The home he grew up in was anything but stable, though. And he and his stepfather clashed constantly, because his mother and stepfather divorced, then reconciled, and then would divorce again. And therapists who evaluated him over the years saw the same thing every time. Todd resented his stepfather, and the father he actually wanted to be with was his biological dad, but that was someone he hadn't seen in 8 years. But the warning signs showed up early. As far back as nursery school, teachers watched him go after other children and break their things. And by age 9, he was in counseling, and the clinical language in his file was pretty blunt. It was just explosive. And for a 9-year-old, a disturbing fixation, which was, quote, "preoccupied with sexual content," unquote. And he also hurt animals, and he shot a neighbor's dog with a BB gun, and he killed a goldfish by pouring Clorox bleach into the bowl. And years later, his birth father tried to describe his son's emotional rage, and all he could come up with was anger and madness, and that was it. And those were the only 2 settings. Just a rageful, mean little 9-year-old asshole, essentially. So at 9 years old, Todd was admitted to the Georgia Mental Health Institute as an inpatient. And he stayed for 3.5 months, and he couldn't get along with the other children. And while there, the therapist documented 2 things. Todd still openly hated his stepfather, and his fixation on sexual content persisted. And the marriage between his mother and stepfather collapsed again in 1982. And that summer, Todd was sent to stay with William Samsell, his biological father. And it was the first real time they really had together. But the visit would end, and Todd returned home to his mother. And that's when he would take a hammer to his own bedroom and just tear it apart. And then he told his mother he'd kill her if she didn't let him go back to his father's. And that October, the Spartanburg School District flagged the 12-year-old now for an evaluation, because teachers just could not control this kid, because he would blow up at the smallest provocation, defy authority on reflex, and shut down completely if anyone corrected him. The evaluation stretched from December 1982 through May 1983. And once the evaluation wrapped up, Regina agreed to let Todd go. And he packed up and moved to Arizona, where his father was waiting. And a neighbor described the boy as a devil on a chain. And Todd forced her son into a dog kennel, sealed it shut, and sent it rolling across the yard. And then he grabbed the kid and cracked his head against clay pipes. And while her son cried, Todd just laughed. He thought it was hilarious. And once settled in Arizona, Todd dropped the Kohlep name temporarily and went by Samsel again. And he started working whatever odd jobs he could find nearby. And his father actually collected weapons and taught the boy how to handle them. That is not good parenting for a child that is literally diagnosed as crazy and angry and rageful. But what do I know? I'm not a parent, you know? And he would also show Todd how to blow things up and make bombs. I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the tree, essentially, is what we're seeing right now. A little nature, a little nurture, working 50-50 in this one. But this father-son relationship would fall apart too, because William was constantly gone, spending his time with a string of girlfriends. And Todd asked to go back to his mother, but Regina didn't want him back. Not surprising. And every time Todd asked to come home, she found another reason to delay. So neither parent, it seemed, wanted to be the one holding the devil on the chain. And on November 25th, 1986, 15-year-old Todd kidnapped a 14-year-old girl named Christy Granado in Tempe, Arizona. And he forced her at gunpoint with a .22 caliber revolver. And he marched her back to the house where he was living, restrained her, covered her mouth with tape, and asked her. And afterward, he walked her home and he told her if she said a word, he'd kill her entire family. Oh my God. But luckily, she would tell them anyway. And Kohlep was charged with kidnapping and assault and committing a dangerous crime against children. And a guilty plea on the kidnapping count came in 1987, and the charge and the charge for crimes against children were dismissed as part of the deal, and the sentence was 15 years in prison. And court records from the case painted a clinical picture, and he was diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, and his IQ tested at 118, which is above average. And the sentencing judge saw exactly what he was dealing with. On paper, the kid had potential, quote, very bright and should be advanced academically, unquote. But that package came with something the court just couldn't fix, quote, behaviorally and emotionally dangerous, unquote. So rehabilitation, the judge concluded, was unlikely. And as probation officer noted in the court file, Kohlep, quote, felt the world owed him something, unquote. And in prison, the early years looked like a continuation of everything before. And he racked up violations, and some of them were violent. But after he turned 20, something shifted, and there were no more incidents on his record. And whether that meant he'd changed or simply just learned how to hide was a question no one seemed to ask. So while locked up, Kohlep earned a degree in computer science from Central Arizona College. And in August of 2001, after 14 years behind bars, he would walk out. And he was now 30 years old. And he moved to South Carolina to live with his mother. And on November 30th, 2001, he registered as a sex offender. And for the next few years, he bounced between jobs and classrooms. And he worked graphic design at a Spartanburg company for almost 2 years, and he enrolled at Greenville Technical College. And then in 2006, he applied for a South Carolina real estate license. And the application asked about prior felony convictions, and Kohlep naturally lied on that question, and the license was granted. She's not doing criminal background checks in 2006, or what's going on there? Anyway, and by 2008, he had a bachelor's degree from the University of South Carolina Upstate in business administration and marketing. And by then, he was already building his empire. And his real estate brokerage grew fast. At its peak, 12 agents worked under him, and other agents knew his name. And he ranked among the top sellers in the Carolinas. And on top of all that, he got certified to fly planes and started buying real estate in other states. And the people around him saw a driven, confident professional. And Cherry Lawrence, who worked for him, said, quote, he was an excellent boss. He stood up for us whenever we needed him, unquote. And everyone in the office knew about the registry. That actually wasn't a secret, but Kohlep had a story for that. Of course he had a backup story for that. But he told people the whole thing was overblown. He'd gone joyriding with a girl, and her father blew it out of proportion. And his neighbor, Ron Owens, saw nothing alarming either. Quote, Todd was, in my opinion, a likable guy, unquote. But cracks showed if you knew where to look. And a woman who'd done a real estate deal with him said the charm was real at first. But the longer you talked to Kohlhepp, the more he drifted. Guns kept coming up, and his comments took on a sexual edge that made people uncomfortable. He was a regular at a Waffle House in Roebuck, and the women on staff dreaded seeing him walk in. And eventually, the cook, a man, took over serving him because none of the waitresses wanted to go near his table. And one of those waitresses was a young woman named Megan Lee McCraw Coxey. Now, on November 6th, 2003, a customer walked into Superbike Motorsports, a motorcycle dealership in Chesney, South Carolina, and he found 4 people shot, 2 inside the shop and 2 outside. They were dead. And one of those people was Scott Ponder, who was 30, who owned the shop, and the other was his mother, Beverly Guy, 52 years old, the bookkeeper, and then there was Brian Lucas, who was 29 years old and was the service manager. And lastly, there was Chris Sherbert, who was 26-year-old and was a mechanic. And Scott's wife, Melissa, didn't see him leave that morning, as she was still in bed, and she was 7 weeks pregnant. And she never saw him alive again. But all 4 died from multiple gunshot wounds, and investigators pieced together a theory of what happened. Sherbert was the first to die, shot while working in the back of the building, and Beverly Guy was next, killed on the showroom floor, and Brian Lucas went down near the front door, and Scott Ponder was gunned down outside in the parking lot. Detectives collected 18 9mm shell casings from the scene, a mix of brass and nickel-plated rounds, and 2 different types of ammunition, which complicated the ballistic analysis from the start. And the case consumed the small community of Chesney, and rumors would spread fast. And some people blamed a Mexican drug gang, and others whispered about a love triangle. The speculation crushed the victims' families, and as the years dragged on, detectives ran ballistics on every weapon they thought might be connected, and 27 guns in total. And not one of them matched the casings from the scene, though. And at one point, the shell casings crossed the Atlantic, and a lab in England had advanced fingerprint technology that didn't exist in the US at the time, and even that came back empty. Nothing worked. And Sheriff Chuck Wright later explained why Kohlhepp had never been on their radar, saying, quote, "There was no reason to interview everybody. There was nothing in the gentleman's background that screamed, 'I did this,'" unquote. So the case went cold, and it stayed that way for 13 years. And when the truth finally came out, the motive would be almost impossible to believe, because he wanted to learn how to ride a motorcycle, and they laughed at him when he fell over on the bike. So 4 people dead because someone felt humiliated. And while the Superbike investigation stalled, Kohlhepp was quietly building something else. The property he bought in May 2014 sat about 9 miles outside Moore, South Carolina, nearly 100 acres of rural land, and the price tag was $305,632. And then he spent another $80,000 on a chain-link fence around the entire perimeter, and motion-activated deer cameras went up in the tree line to monitor anyone approaching, and bear traps were scattered across the grounds as well. And his neighbor, Scott Waldrop, had lived next door for over 2 decades. And to Waldrop, the guy next door was just another survivalist type, someone who wanted to be left alone and took it more seriously than most. Nothing threatening about that. Quote, "He didn't seem like a threat," unquote. And he would assume he was a survivalist because Kohlhepp had a shipping container he purchased on his property, actually that his girlfriend purchased for him, Holly Udy. So Holly would put up the money for the shipping container in 2014, and as far as she knew, it was just for storing supplies, like food, ammo, standard prepper gear. And as a convicted felon, Kohlhepp couldn't legally buy firearms, so he used a man named Dustin Lawson to do it for him. And over a 4-year stretch from 2012 to 2016, Lawson made purchase after purchase on Kohlhepp's behalf. 12 firearms, 5 silencers, and every time he filled out the federal paperwork claiming he was the buyer, and every single form was a lie. And the weapons were spread across the property, some hidden in drawers, others sitting out in the open on shelving, and some mounted underneath a workbench where you'd never spot them unless you were looking, and a gun safe, a stockpile of ammunition. So the property wasn't a farm, it was a retreat. It was a trap. So on August 31st, 2016, the day Kayla and Charlie disappeared, this is what actually happened. Kayla and Charlie pulled up to the entrance of Todd's property expecting a day of yard work. And Kohlhepp told them he needed to unlock the front gate first. So they followed his vehicle through, and after they drove through, Kohlhepp secured the gate so no one could get in or out. And Kayla didn't think anything of it, because they had worked for Kohlhepp several times before. So the three of them kept driving, and a 2-story garage came into view first, and then a metal shipping container sitting off the side. And inside the garage, Kohlhepp handed them each a bottle of water and a pair of hedge clippers, and he told them he'd walk them out to the trail where he wanted it to be cleared. So they stepped outside, and then Kohlhepp paused and said he'd forgotten something, so he went back inside by himself. And Kayla and Charlie would just stand together in the quiet, hand in hand. And a few minutes would pass. And then Kohlhepp came back through the door, but now he was holding a gun. And he didn't say a word, but 3 rounds would hit Charlie in the chest. And Kohlhepp was completely calm. And after he shot Charlie, he would swing around toward Kayla, and he would take her by the hand and order her into the garage. And he would tell her if she didn't, she would join Charlie. So once they were inside, he shoved her down. Metal cuffs went around her wrists first, and then her ankles. And after that, he forced a ball gag between her teeth, and then he stood up and told her he had to go deal with Charlie. And meanwhile, at this point in time, the outside world hadn't noticed a thing. And Kayla's phone stopped sending replies on August 31st, as we know, and Charlie's went dark around the same time. So for the first couple of days, nobody panicked. But the days kept passing, and neither one of them came back. And Kayla Brown and Charlie Carver were now gone. And while the people who loved them were beginning to realize something was wrong, Kayla was already locked up inside a shipping container less than an hour's drive away. So that first day, after Kohlhepp handcuffed and gagged Kayla, he took Kayla to that storage container sitting on the property. And it was 30 feet long and 15 feet wide, but pitch black inside. And a chain also went around her neck, and he fastened it to the wall at the back of the container. And then he chained her ankle in the opposite corner. And the length of the chain around her neck was 2.5, maybe 3 feet long. So essentially, she was shackled in this container like a dog. So at this point in time, she's realizing that she's a prisoner and also dealing with the fact that the love of her life just died in front of her. And at some point afterward, Kayla caught sight of Charlie's body. It had been rolled into a blue tarp, and he put Charlie in the ground. And Kayla didn't know where, and Charlie's car vanished along with him. Kohlhepp changed its color from white to brown with spray paint, and then drove it into the woods and buried it under branches until it was very difficult to see. And Kohlhepp killed Charlie to just take him away from Kayla and to more easily control her. But Charlie Carver was dead before the afternoon was over, and there were rations stacked inside the container and bottles of water, but that was it. No light, no ventilation beyond whatever crept through the metal seams. And it was late August in South Carolina, and the heat inside that box was suffocating. I can't even imagine. She was alone in the dark for hours before he showed up again. And he would tell her that if she tried to run, he would kill her. And if she tried to hurt him, he would kill her. And if she ever fought back, he would kill her. So Todd Kohlhepp would come back after disposing of Charlie and his car, and he would repeatedly rape Kayla. And this was just the first day. But Kayla would spend her captivity on 2 thin dog beds pushed against the wall of the container, and she would eat crackers and peanut butter and cheese that was sometimes moldy. And when she needed a bathroom, all she had was a 5-gallon bucket. And Kohlhepp had placed an air freshener on the lid. And for the first 7 days, the heat inside the metal box was so brutal that she stripped down to her bra and underwear just to breathe. And once fall arrived and the air inside the container turned cold, he showed up with sweatpants and yoga pants for her to wear. And Kohlhepp gave her things to pass the time, like books and coloring books made for adults, and a small MP3 player loaded with music, and small comforts designed to make a cage feel like something less than a cage. But his routine would never change. 2 times every day, he'd unlock the container and give her between 30 to 45 minutes outside of it. And those breaks happened in a 2-story garage on the grounds. And she was allowed food there and, on some visits, access to an actual toilet. But every second day, he handed her a small basin of water, and that was as close to bathing as she got, because there was no bathtub. And she was never fully unchained during any of this. He would just consistently put more chains on as he took her off the other chains, always keeping her chained up. And every single day, he would rape her, often multiple times a day. Which is just, the level of evil in this man is unprecedented. It's just absolutely disgusting. And at one point, he dragged her across the property to show her something, and it was 3 mounds of earth that looked like graves. And he would tell her, Kayla, if you try to escape, you're going directly in one of those graves. But the threats weren't the only tool he used. He would tell Kayla she was beautiful, that she was smart, that he'd chosen her specifically. He would sit her down and explain Stockholm Syndrome to her by name. He would tell her that the happiness would kick in and they would be happy together at some point. Just absolutely delusional, ludicrous. And he laid out plans for a room with soundproofed walls, and that's where she would be kept long term. And he told her that someday, if she proved herself loyal, the entire property would be open to her, all 95 acres. And then, in the same breath, he'd remind her that nothing about her survival was guaranteed. But as long as she served her purpose, she would be safe. And he would just brag constantly about how many people he'd actually killed and about how skilled he was at it. And he described a woman named Megan. And she'd been locked up on the same property. The Megan we talked about before that worked at the restaurant. And eventually, he murdered her as well. And he claimed his body count was close to 100. And those people he killed meant nothing to him. They were objects. There was one thing he struggled with, though, looking someone in the eye while he did it. If a person was staring straight at him, he said he couldn't quite pull the trigger. And he also told her about other targets, a woman named Holly and Holly's boyfriend. And Kohlhepp said he was planning to kill them both if he could figure out a way to get them alone. And through all of it, Kohlhepp kept telling Kayla that nobody was coming. And he just minimized everything and made her feel so small and just forgotten. And he just told her no one was looking for you anymore, and that the world had just moved on without her. But Kayla didn't believe him. And she would soon figure out that survival meant making Kohlhepp think he was in total control. And about a month in, something shifted. And Kohlhepp had made his terms clear from the beginning. No escape attempts, no resistance, and she lives. So 4 weeks in, Kayla finally believed him. And that realization didn't make her compliant. He was not going to kill her, not as long as she played along. And if he wasn't going to kill her, then he couldn't take anything from her that she didn't hand over. It made her dangerous. So in those weeks, there were only 2 occasions where she saw anything beyond the garage or the inside of a metal box. And once, he chained her to a 4-wheeler and drove her around part of the property. And after weeks in total darkness, with barely enough room to shift positions, being outdoors felt like something close to grace. because every day inside the container she would talk to God. And no matter what Kohlhepp told her, she held on to the certainty that people on the outside were searching. And there were moments where the weight of everything pressed in close enough to break her. So Anderson PD's position from day one was that nothing pointed to a crime, even with the abandoned apartment, even with the dog, even with 2 cell phones that went dead on the same day. The official line was non-committal. And they couldn't say it was a crime at this point, but they couldn't say it wasn't. And behind the scenes, though, they were pulling data. And according to Police Chief Jim Stewart, they had a ping request running on Kayla's phone within 48 hours of the missing persons report. And the phone pinged somewhere in Spartanburg County, and then it went dark. In 2 days. That was all they got. So a request for the couple's cell phone records went out on September 9th, and those records didn't come back until September 22nd. But the data told a clear story. On August 31st, both phones hit the same tower, and after that, neither phone registered again. Still, a ping in a rural area doesn't hand you an address. It just gives you a radius. And without more, investigators couldn't really act on it. So Lieutenant Mike Akins was honest about where the case stood, saying, quote, "We tracked down the leads we had, but there isn't very much," unquote. And one trail they did follow was Nicole Carver, Charlie's estranged wife. Because on September 6th, investigators went to speak with her, and Nicole told detectives the apartment door had been unlocked and she'd let herself in. And she walked out with Charlie's computer and Romeo, Kayla's Pomeranian. And according to Nicole, Charlie's browser history had Myrtle Beach searches in it. And detectives had heard through other sources that Nicole claimed Charlie's car was parked at her place with mechanical problems. And they asked to see it, but they didn't find it there. And on September 11th, Joanne brought detectives a set of messages. And she said Nicole had sent them. And one claimed Charlie had called Nicole from a hospital in Myrtle Beach. And another said his car had turned up at the Greenville-Spartanburg International Airport. And investigators chased both leads, but both would come up empty. And September 21st brought a different kind of lead, because a caller tipped off police about suspicious posts going up on Charlie's Facebook account, as we know. And this time, it wasn't just memes and fake milestones. Someone was using Charlie's account to DM people. And the messages said he was doing fine and asked for cash to be sent to Nicole, his ex. And officers traced the IP address behind the activity, and it led to Nicole Carver's home. So one trail kept looping back to the same person, but it never connected to any answer. And there was another problem, because despite the bizarre Facebook activity, despite private messages being sent from a missing man's account, Anderson police had not sought a warrant from Facebook. And Lieutenant Dave Creamer acknowledged as much to the Daily Beast, saying, quote, "To do anything like that, we'd have to issue a search warrant to Facebook. I don't know if we've done that, but I'm pretty sure we have not done that," unquote. And over a month into the investigation, they still hadn't. And dozens of tips poured in over those weeks, and people called in claiming they'd seen Kayla or Charlie or the Grand Prix. And some passed along spots the couple used to frequent, but none of them led anywhere. And then on October 13th, something different came in. And the friend who'd filed Kayla's missing persons report came back to the police because she had something new. A second-hand tip from someone else. And his claim was specific, because he said he'd run into Kayla the day before she vanished, and that her body was on a 100-acre parcel somewhere in Spartanburg County. 100 acres in Spartanburg County, and a body. So investigators went to Kayla's Facebook page and, with a search warrant, combed through her messages. And inside her messages was a thread with Charlie, and they'd been making plans to meet someone named Todd Kohlhepp on August 31st. And he lived in Moore and was supposed to bring them out to a property for work. And when they ran Kohlhepp's name, a 95-acre property in Woodruff, South Carolina, came back under his ownership. Everything clicked at once. And Kayla's phone had last pinged off a cell tower in Spartanburg County. And the Facebook messages placed her with Kohlhepp on the same day she vanished. And his property sat within the range of that tower. And on top of all of it, as we know, Todd Kohlhepp was a registered sex offender. And for 6 weeks, Anderson PD had been running the investigation as a local case. It wasn't until mid-October that they understood the trail led into Spartanburg County. So on October 18th, Spartanburg County Sergeant Brandon Letterman got a phone call. Quote, "You need to meet with these detectives from Anderson." I said, "Okay, for what?" "They've got a missing persons case that might lead up here. They are here now," unquote. So they walked Letterman through the whole picture. 2 people who vanished on August 31st. Cell data placing both of them near Woodruff that same day, and a tip claiming someone was buried on a large rural property in his county. Letterman checked the map, and there was only one property that size within 2 miles of the cell tower, and it belonged to Todd Kohlhepp. So they moved fast after that, and they subpoenaed Kohlhepp's phone data, and it showed his cell hitting the same tower as Kayla's and Charlie's phone on the day they disappeared. And the sheriff's office sent aerial surveillance over that same property the same day, and first a drone, and then a helicopter. And dense forest swallowed everything below, though, so they really didn't see anything. And 2 weeks later, why was it 2 weeks later? What is going on? Letterman's court order for Kohlhepp's full cell records came through, and the records backed up what they already believed. Kohlhepp's phone and Kayla's were pinging off the same tower on August 31st, right around the same time she went silent. And combined with everything else, it gave them probable cause for a search warrant. So on November 3rd, 2016, 2 teams deployed at the same time. A 3-person team headed to Kohlhepp's house on Winsong Way in Moore, and 1 detective from Anderson, 2 from Spartanburg County, and the rest converged on the Woodruff property. And at the house, they'd sit across from Kohlhepp and start picking apart his story. And at the property, they'd start cutting through locks. And he didn't know it yet, but both halves of his life were about to collapse at the exact same moment. So on November 3rd, 2016, the search party hit Kohlhepp's Woodruff property around 8:30 in the morning. And they would go to the barn first. And on the second floor, in a loft that had been converted into a crude apartment, they found a U-bolt chains fastened around a bed frame. But nobody was there. But the chains told them they were in the right place. So they moved onto the shipping container. And it was green, metal, and sealed tight. And one of the deputies brought a sledgehammer down on the lock, holding the container shut. And from inside, someone screamed, "Help!" And Spartanburg County Sheriff Chuck Wright was miles away when the call came in. He didn't hesitate. Quote, "I got there in 6 minutes. It was 25 minutes away, and I made it in 6, unquote. And by the time Wright arrived, his deputies were already working on the container door, and 5 separate locks held it shut, and they cut through every one. And body cam footage shows them pushing inside, and flashlight beams cutting through pitch black, weapons up, shelves lined the walls, plastic water bottles by the case, and supplies stacked everywhere. Something that looked like a cage sat in the middle of the space, all the way to the back of the bin. And there was Kayla Brown. 65 days after she vanished, a chain ran from her neck to the wall. And her ankle was locked in a separate shackle, and she had on glasses and a black shirt, gray pants, and sandals, like she'd been dressed for a normal day that never ended. And she was surrounded by the remnants of her captivity. Dog beds, a bucket with an air freshener sitting on top, crackers, books, and coloring books, that MP3 player. And when rescuers asked about Charlie, Kayla didn't hesitate, and she said, "We shot him." And then, while deputies were still working to unchain her, she gave them everything.
Todd Kohlhepp shot Charlie Carver 3 times in the chest, wrapped him in a blue tarp, put him in the bucket of the tractor, locked me down here, and I never seen him again. He says he's dead and buried. He says there's several bodies dead and buried out here.
And when the questioning was done, she began to cry. And she told them Kohlhepp had shot her boyfriend because of her, so they would get the chains off of her, and someone wrapped a towel around her. And then they walked her out into the open air, and it was the first sunlight she'd seen in more than 2 months. And Detective Bradley Whitefield of Anderson City Police Department was one of the first people to reach her, saying, quote unquote, "I was shocked and amazed." And Detective Charlin Ezel was right beside him. And Kayla looked at her and said, quote, "Thank you so much for finding me," unquote. And Whitfield broke down later when he tried to describe what he'd witnessed that day, saying, quote, "I think we all saw a lot of things that day that are going to stay with us," unquote. And Kayla described that moment from her side of the container wall, saying, quote, "I think it was 9 o'clock. I start hearing noises, and then I heard somebody's voice, and I couldn't say anything. I couldn't breathe, like I panicked. Somebody came up and asked if I was in there. They said, 'We're going to get you out,'" unquote. And on the way to the hospital, Kayla kept talking. And in the ambulance, she started giving up what Kallep had told her, a husband and wife he'd murdered before she was ever taken. And then she told them something bigger. 4 people gunned down inside a motorcycle dealership in Spartanburg County. Nobody had ever been arrested, and that was 13 years ago. That shooting we talked about previously. And Sheriff Wright spoke to reporters that evening. Kayla was alive and well, he would say, but she was obviously traumatized. And when pressed again on her condition later that night, he offered a small consolation. And he told reporters she was in good spirits and that she looked good for someone who'd spent 65 days in a metal box. And Wright credited 2 things for the outcome. Finding Kayla, he said, came down to divine intervention from God himself, and the rest, he said, was good investigative work, the kind that put boots on the right piece of ground. And Dan Heron, the family friend who'd been searching for Kayla since Labor Day, learned the news the way most people learn impossible things, just out of nowhere. Quote, "I found out they were missing on Labor Day weekend. After searching for her for 2 months, I then got a text message from another good friend of mine, and she said they found Kayla. She's alive," unquote. And Kayla's family released a statement through In Missing Pieces Network the next day. Physically, she was doing well, but on the emotional side, it was a different story. Quote unquote, "Good moments and bad moments. I can't even imagine, my God." And they would ask for privacy, saying, quote, "Right now, Kayla needs time to process and begin to cope with the events that have occurred," unquote. So while Kayla was being pulled from that container, Todd was sitting in his living room on Winsong Way in Moore, talking to a different set of investigators. And they'd shown up that morning to ask about his cell phone. And the conversation started politely. And at that point, neither side knew what the other team had just found. And then the phone calls started coming in. And updates started filtering in from the team out in Woodruff. And each call changed the temperature in the room. And the tone in the room shifted. And they cuffed him. And then they told him what his colleagues had just pulled out of that container.
"My sergeant served a search warrant on your property.
Okay.
We have Kayla.
Excuse me?
She was locked in a container. She has told us that you shot and killed Charlie. You're under arrest right now for kidnapping, all right? They're continuing to search your property. They're going to continue. They got cadaver dogs down there, okay?
And when asked directly why he shot Charlie, he answered, quote unquote, "I didn't shoot anybody, sir." And they asked about the container, about why a woman was chained inside it on his property, and he had no answer at that time. And he asked for a lawyer. And the arrest happened just before 2 p.m. on November 3rd, 2016. And Kallep was taken into custody at his own home. And back on the property, investigators began tearing the place apart. And they found Charlie's formerly white sedan in the woods, and they found Charlie's grave. And a tattoo on his shoulder confirmed it was Charlie. And the coroner's report told the rest, his multiple gunshot wounds all clustered in his upper body. And over the next few days, they found more. And investigators kept digging. And on November 6th, they recovered a body. And on November 7th, another. And they belonged to a husband and a wife. Johnny Joe Coxey, 29 years old, and Megan Lee McCraw Coxey, who was 25 years old. And the couple had been reported missing on December 22nd, 2015, out in Spartanburg. And the Coxeys had been standing on the corner of Reedville and Blackstock Road, panhandling, when Kallep pulled up and offered them a job on his land. And both had extensive tattoos. And that's how the coroner was able to identify them. And the coroner's findings told 2 different stories. Johnny died first, a bullet to the torso, and Megan survived him by about a week, alone on that property with the man who killed her husband. And she was killed on Christmas Day, or the day after, with a single gunshot wound to the head. And Kallep later explained the gap. He shot Coxey on the spot, and McCraw Coxey he tried to keep, just the same pattern he tried to repeat with Kayla. And his reason was that she'd tried to burn her way out. because he'd given her cigarettes and she used them to start a fire inside of the container. So 3 bodies total recovered from the 95 acres, along with a stockpile of weapons that shouldn't have existed. Suppressed 9mm semi-auto rifles and ammunition. So much of it that no one even tried to tally the count. And not one firearm on the property had a background check tied to Kohlhepp's name. As we know, his friend bought him for him, so obviously they wouldn't be tied to Kohlhepp. And every weapon on the property had been obtained illegally. And upstairs in the second-floor living area Kohlhepp had built for himself, investigators opened the top drawer of a dresser, and inside they would find a set of handcuffs. Now, Kohlhepp asked for an attorney the day he was arrested, but 2 days later, on November 5th, he changed his mind, and he contacted Tommy Clark and Mark Gaddy himself. No lawyer and no conditions, just a willingness to talk. And he rode out to the Woodruff property with the 2 detectives and showed them where the bodies were buried. And his price for cooperating was small and specific. He wanted to talk to his mommy, and he wanted to give her a picture. And he wanted to transfer money into the college fund of a friend's child. And in exchange, he gave up everything. And he confessed to the mass shooting at Superbike Motorsports in 2003, the cold case that had haunted Spartanburg County for 13 years. Just 4 people executed inside a motorcycle dealership and not a single arrest. And his account of Superbike included information no one outside the investigation had ever heard. And Sheriff Wright put it bluntly, saying, quote, "He told us some stuff that nobody ought to know," unquote. And he described going back through the building after the initial shots and putting a single round into the forehead of every victim. Quote, "I proceeded to walk back into the building again to clear, and I went. I put 1 round in each person's forehead," unquote. And in interrogation footage, his demeanor was absolutely chilling. And he spoke about the massacre with a detachment of someone reviewing, game tape.
So it's like, at that point, it's almost like a video game. It's not a game, but it's almost like you're focused on, you've been there, sir. You know what I'm talking about.
My golf game is weak. My kill game is strong.
Jesus. Just throw him in a deep, dark hole. But he laughed after the last one, and he bragged about the precautions he'd taken to avoid being caught. Every round he loaded into that weapon, he did it wearing gloves. And that way, no prints would end up on the brass. And when it was over, he disassembled the gun. Each piece went into a separate trash can, and he buried the barrel at the bottom of a bag of dirty cat litter. And for 13 years, that was enough. Investigators had actually known his name the entire time. Kohlhepp was a former Superbike customer. And 10 years after the killings, his name came up on a mailing list. And the mailing list was for former customers. A detective sent out a generic letter in 2013 hoping someone might talk, but obviously he never responded. Melissa Ponder was living in Arizona by then. Just 13 years of silence. And then her phone rang, and it was a detective from the original Superbike investigation, and he told her about the arrest, and the detective told her something she'd waited 13 years to hear. The man in custody knew things about the murders that had never been shared outside that investigation. So 13 years of silence broken in a single phone call. And as the scope of his confessions widened, so did the contradictions. And inside the container, Kohlhepp had told Kayla he killed Charlie for control. And in those first hours after rescue, Kayla told investigators something different, that Kohlhepp had been, quote-unquote, mad at her. And Kohlhepp's mother offered yet another version. According to her, Charlie's mouth got him killed because he had a really smart mouth, she said, and that was something her son would never let slide. And in his own confession, Kohlhepp gave a 4th explanation.
I don't know how to answer that, honestly. I was angry at her, I was angry at him. It just went right quickly.
So 4 different versions, and none of them agree. But Kohlhepp wasn't done talking, and his mother came to see him after the arrest. And he told her the body count was higher than investigators had found. And she asked, how many? Quote, "You do not have enough fingers," unquote. And he claimed he'd shot a man in Arizona when he was 14. And Tempe PD started pulling cold case files and 30 years worth of unsolved killings looking for anything that might match. But beyond the basic claim, he had almost nothing to offer. No names, no specifics, no charges ever came from it. But after the arrest, journalists began combing through Kohlhepp's digital footprint, and someone had been leaving product reviews on Amazon for years, and the account was registered under the name Me, and the wish list attached to it carried a different name, Todd Kohlhepp. And the first review went up in 2014, the same year Kohlhepp bought the 95 acres. And there were 140 of them, and the products ranged from tactical gear and weapon accessories to field medical kits and books on sniping, rappelling, and battlefield surgery, and a shopping list for someone preparing for war. And the reviews included one about a lock stating, quote-unquote, "Solid locks, have 5 on a shipping container, won't stop them, but sure will slow them down till they are too old to care." That is so incredibly disgusting and disturbing that an Amazon review, a serial killer, is putting up Amazon reviews about a victim. Just, oh my God. It makes my stomach turn. Holy shit. But these reviews would later earn him the nickname Amazon Review Killer. But before the weekend was over, the state had 4 new murder charges on the books, and all of them tied to the 2003 Superbike Motorsports killings after 13 years of dead ends, solved because a woman in a shipping container refused to die. So on May 26, 2017, Todd Kohlhepp stood in Spartanburg County courtroom and pleaded guilty. 7 counts of murder, 4 counts of possessing a weapon during a violent crime, and 2 counts of kidnapping, and 1 count of first-degree criminal sexual conduct, and 14 charges in all. And the sentence came down the same day. 17 consecutive life terms without parole, plus 30 years for the kidnapping of Kayla Brown, plus 30 more for assault, all running back to back. Every piece of it was negotiated in advance, and the solicitor put everything on paper, and the agreement ran 9 pages long, and everyone involved signed it. Kohlhepp, his lawyers, solicitor Barry Barnett, Kayla Brown, a representative for each of the 7 murder victims, Sheriff Wright, and an attorney from the South Carolina Department of Probation, Parole, and Pardon Services. And under the terms, Kohlhepp gave up his right to appeal in any court, state, or federal. And parole was off the table permanently, thank God, and he couldn't seek it. And if someone offered it anyway, the agreement required him to turn it down. So there's no way this guy's getting out of jail. And one more clause sat at the bottom. Any escape attempt, any violation of any term, and the whole agreement dissolved. And the state could then re-sentence him on every charge and put the death penalty back in play. Which raised the obvious question, why not seek it from the start? Well, Barnett addressed that directly, saying, quote, "Todd Kohlhepp deserves the death penalty. But the reality of the situation is that our state doesn't have a functioning death penalty. The last execution occurred in 2011, and the state's supply of lethal injection drugs expired shortly thereafter," unquote. So it was a practical calculation wrapped in an ugly truth. The plea spared Kayla from testifying on the stand, thank goodness, and it spared the families of 7 victims from years of appeals. And it meant that Kohlhepp's confessions to the Superbike killings, the cold case that had hollowed out a community for 13 years, would finally stand as a matter of legal record. And the families showed up, and they filled the benches in the courtroom and waited for the words they'd spent years needing to hear. And one of Megan McCraw Coxey's family members stood and addressed the court, saying, quote, "Today is not so much his day in court as it is Megan's day of justice and retribution," unquote. And he said he could never forgive Kohlhepp. Not today, not ever. And Kayla was also there, and her legal team told the court she'd planned to be there, and she wanted to look at Kohlhepp directly. But post-traumatic stress disorder kept her away, and she agreed with the plea deal. And her message to the court was delivered through her legal team. Quote unquote, "He's the killer, not me." And after the criminal proceedings closed, the civil cases began. And Kayla went after Kohlhepp's estate in civil court, and the complaint listed kidnapping, assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligence. And the initial filing asked for $360 million. And that number accounted for everything, including medical costs, the pain she'd endured, and the emotional wreckage, and the future she'd been robbed of. And when Kohlhepp didn't respond to the filing, the court entered a default judgment, and the award totaled $6.3 million, roughly $1.5 million in actual damages and $4.7 million in punitive damages. And her attorney put it in perspective, saying, quote, "No amount of money will ever compensate Kayla for what Todd Kohlhepp did to her," unquote. And Charlie's dad, Chuck, filed a wrongful death suit of his own. And Cindy Coxey, the mother of Johnny Coxey, filed another. And the families of the Superbike victims filed theirs as well. And in December of 2018, the Superbike families came face-to-face with KallMeKris during a civil damages hearing. And Thomas Lucas, Brian's father, tried to describe what 15 years of grief felt like, saying, quote, "We have some answers, we have some information, but the pure heartache never goes away," unquote. And Lorraine Lucas, Brian's mother, refused to look away, saying, quote, "I'm not afraid to stare him down. He took my son's life and the life of 3 other people for whatever stupidity. He gave me eye contact. I'm sure my eyes said everything that was in my heart," unquote. And to pay for those judgments, KallMeKris's assets were liquidated and his personal belongings went up for auction. And over 550 items in total, power tools, gas cans, rain barrels, books, a gun safe, an ATV, even a handcuff key. Every item was sold. Nothing was left on the table. And the 95-acre property was sold separately in a foreclosure auction. And every dollar raised was directed towards settlement payouts for the people KallMeKris had destroyed. But Chuck, Charlie's dad, watched the bidding and felt something other than justice. The idea of strangers collecting objects connected to his son's murder made no sense to him. And some buyers said the money was their way of helping the families, but Chuck wasn't buying it. And he figured most of those people would turn around and resell what they'd bought. So 3 months before the plea deal, Kayla Brown sat across from Dr. Phil McGraw for a 2-part interview that aired on February 13th and 14th, 2017. And it was her first time telling the story on national television. And she did not flinch. Quote, "No matter what he did to me, he did not break me. He cannot destroy who I am, and I won," unquote. And she talked about Charlie, saying, quote, "I'll always miss Charlie. I'll always wonder what our life would have looked like. But as far as what Todd did to me, I am not going to let that man rule my life," unquote. And at one point in the interview, Dr. Phil asked the question directly, had she thought about ending things in that container? And Kayla said Charlie's face and the image of her mother waiting at home shut that door before it could open. And she described the moment rescue stopped feeling like a dream and started feeling real, saying, quote, "I didn't feel safe until I had Mama in my arms," unquote. And the public saw someone just incredibly strong, someone unbroken. But what they couldn't see is that survival doesn't end when the locks come off. And in the months that followed her rescue, Kayla began seeing a man named Adam Mason. And they would get engaged, but the wedding would never happen because Adam stabbed in the chest at his home. Oh my God, Jesus Christ. And he was rushed to the hospital, but went into cardiac arrest and didn't survive. And later, she began dating James Devin Moore. And in July of 2019, both were arrested on domestic assault charges. And when the Greenville News reached out, Kayla's spokesperson, Jenny Dial, said she had stopped taking her medication before the incident. And after that, the headlines stopped. And after 2019, she stepped back from all of it. No interviews, no public appearances. Almost nothing is known now about where she is or what she's doing. Because trauma doesn't follow a straight line. And it doesn't resolve on schedule or dissolve under bright lights. The domestic incident was not excusable, but it doesn't erase what she endured. And it confirms how deep the damage went. And Charlie's family buried him in a different way. And his memorial service was held on November 19th, 2016 at North Anderson Baptist Church. And it was the day he would have turned 33. And the people who came to the service remembered a man who worked at a tissue factory and dreamed bigger than his paycheck allowed. A pool player who competed in leagues around town, a veteran of the National Guard, and an author with 4 completed mysteries behind him. And a 5th nearly done that never got finished. And a son whose father said he'd hand you whatever he had. And what this case peeled back was something most people would rather not look at. Because how does a man with a felony kidnapping conviction and a spot on the registry walk into a licensing office and walk out a real estate agent? One question on the application stood between Todd KallMeKris and a professional career. And he lied, and nobody checked. But Todd KallMeKris is serving 7 consecutive life sentences. He cannot appeal, he cannot seek parole, and if those terms feel redundant, they were meant to be. Because for years after his conviction, he was housed at Broad River Correctional Institution, and that changed in June 2025. And Fox Carolina ran an investigation into what KallMeKris had been up to behind bars. And the findings got him shipped to Kirkland Correctional Institution, a supermax facility, on an indefinite basis. And he'd been selling merchandise t-shirts stamped with the letters SKTK, serial killer Todd Kohlhepp. And on top of that, he'd been talking to a producer who he wanted to help him package his story for an audience. And he'd been sent autographed confession documents, autopsy reports of his own victims, which is disgusting, and a signed Superbike Motorsports business card to a woman outside the prison with instructions to sell them. And people were paying up to $65 a pop for that kind of material on a website that trade in serial killer memorabilia. And none of this was on the Department of Corrections' radar. It took a Fox Carolina news team bringing the evidence to their attention before anyone inside the system realized what was happening. And Kohlhepp lost his tablet privileges indefinitely, and South Carolina's Inspector General got involved too, looking into whether profiting off the murders could land Kohlhepp with new criminal charges. And state law in South Carolina makes it illegal for a prisoner to earn money from acts that put them behind bars. And he told investigators there were more victims, but he wouldn't say how many, and he wouldn't say where. So investigators wanted him to walk them to the graves, but he wouldn't do it. And a search of the property turned up nothing, and Spartanburg County called it off. And Wright drew a line. His department was done digging until Kohlhepp gave them real information they could actually check. He wasn't going to let a man in a cage control the narrative from behind concrete walls. There may be names that haven't been spoken yet. Families somewhere in Arizona, in South Carolina, in places no one has thought to look, still waiting for someone who never came home. And nearly a decade later, he says he wished he'd held the line. Quote, "Had I known 9 or 10 years later that we would still be doing the same thing, I should have stuck to my guns and said, no, I'm not signing that agreement," unquote. But the story was never about him. It was about the people he took. Charles David Charlie Carver, Scott Dean Ponder, Beverly Elaine Guy, Brian Thomas Lucas, Christopher Michael Shuby Sherbert, Johnny Joe Coxey, Megan Lee McCraw Coxey, and Kayla Brown. And that is it for this case. Let me know what other cases you would like me to deep dive into down below. I always read the comments, and until next time, stay beautiful and stay safe. And a big fuck you, you piece of shit, to Todd Kohlhepp. See you in the next one. Crime, conspiracy, murder, cults, your mom. Just kidding, we're not talking about your mom. But we are talking about murder today. Specifically, serial killers. Specifically, the Piggy Palace killer, the pig farmer killer, the butcher. We're talking about Robert Pickton. For those of you who don't know who Robert Pickton is, in 2001, Robert Pickton was charged for murdering 26 women, dismembering them, and feeding them to his pigs on his pig farm in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia, Canada. Although Pickton claimed to have killed 49 women between the years 1983 and 2002. And this quickly became the largest serial killer investigation in Canadian history. And this one hits really close to home, literally, because I lived 30 minutes away from where this took place, and I was alive. We're not going to talk about how old I am, but I remember all of this happening. And I remember vividly how this investigation absolutely shook the city and neighboring cities to their core. It was terrifying to know somebody so close to home was committing these atrocities against mothers, daughters, sisters, aunties, and it struck fear in a lot of people for a really long time because this was an extremely long, drawn-out investigation. But this also was my weird awakening into not liking true crime, but being interested in true crime. When I was a little tyke and hearing about the story, I just wanted to catch them all like Pokemon and throw them into Satan's fire or jail. So that's actually why I ended up taking criminology in university, because I really wanted to, catch criminals. And alas, I dropped out and became a hairdresser instead, and then randomly became a YouTuber. And I think we've come full circle because now I'm talking about it. So I'm making the best of both worlds, but I digress. Let's unbuckle our seatbelts, go Mach 5 down a dirt road, slam on the brakes, deep dive through the windshield into this pig pen of a story. Let's get to it. So, Robert William Picton was born on October 24th, 1949, in British Columbia, Canada, and a middle child of 3. I've never not wanted to be a middle child more in my life. But anyway, he was born to Leonard and Louise Picton, and he was raised on his family-owned pig farm in Port Coquitlam. His father was a farmer, obviously, and when he was younger, he met his 16-year younger wife in a coffee shop in Port Coquitlam. Oh, that's so sweet. They probably like touched hands when she passed him a muffin or something, and they looked into each other's eyes and saw how beautiful one another were, and then they fell in love. Isn't that such a nice little meet cute story? Isn't it? Isn't it? Well, no, because they were both pieces of rotten shit, just like their son, like mother, father, and son. All these people are POSs, all right? Robert Picton's parents would make even Satan raise an eyebrow or two, if you know what I'm saying. So let's talk about Robert's mommy, Louise Picton, first. So Louise was, let's just say, a kooky lady, and I don't think there's really any pictures of her on the internet. If there are, we'll put them up, but if not, I have a description for you. By the time she was a mid to older adult, and not even older adult, she was in her 30s, all of her teeth had rotted out of her mouth because she just didn't take care of herself. She didn't brush her teeth, she didn't go to the dentist, and it's not because she wasn't well off. These people had money. They were just disgusting. The way I describe this family, it will be so much like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, if you guys have ever seen that movie, and that family, how just gross and visceral and terrible they are. It is that, like, verbatim. It's like they were trying to be these people. And not only were her teeth rotting out of her face in her late 30s to mid 40s, but also all of her hair fell out, which it's fine. Like, it's fine if your hair falls out. It doesn't really matter. But the fact that she's just a terrible human being, it just makes me think she looked like that old decrepit ghoul from the movie The Taking of Deborah Logan. Terrifying. But to make up for the lack of hair on her head, she had a sick goatee, let me tell you. And a sweet mustache, according to people that she knew. So basically, just picture this. And to boot, her choice of attire, according to her friends, okay, would be a house dress over top of very loose jeans and the largest gumboots possible. So she was just waddling around the farm. She looked like a little gremlin, man. I don't know. I think it's kind of funny. But she's a terrible person, and we'll get to that. And she also was extremely short. Again, not that that matters. I'm just describing her to give you a picture. And there's not much known about Leonard Picton and his appearance and how he was, because he was a pretty standoffish kind of father, you know, one that you want approval from but you can't get, and he just beats the shit out of you even every time you try to talk to him. That was Leonard Picton. That's basically all the description we have. But both of Robert's siblings inherited Louise's stunning good looks, but Robert was said to have inherited his dad's rat face. And you know what I mean, because look at this guy. Piece of shit, rat-faced fuck. So it wasn't exactly the Hemsworth family, but I digress. So this good-looking farm family not only housed chickens, ducks, and dogs, but their main animal on the farm was, can you guess it? That's right, pigs. And when I say housed, I don't mean they kept them in separate farms or sheds. I mean they physically had these animals walking through their house, shitting and peeing in their house, and they would never clean it up. They would just wear their boots in the house. So this is just the most disgusting house you've ever stepped foot in. This is basically the worst case in hoarders history, because what they were hoarding was shit, which makes sense in hindsight because the entire family had shit personalities. Am I right? Yeah. So the kids had to slop 200 pigs twice a day. And if you don't know what slopping is, that's basically just feeding the pigs slop. And by doing that, the stench and slop and just pig manure, everything would just stick to these kids. And they'd be coming home from school and doing this and going back to school. So the kids were known to just smell like shit, which, I mean, I just kind of feel bad. Like, they had to work on a farm. I live in a farm town, so that's actually very common. But usually kids shower. But little Robert Picton was scared of water, so we never showered. Just red flag. And their father, Leonard, would also smell like pig shit all the time, and he would earn the name Piggy from the locals. But he didn't seem to care. He actually liked it. It's like when you insult somebody nicely, but then they're just too dumb to understand, like,
whew, someone went with their natural musk today, hey, Leonard?
And Leonard's just like,
oh yeah, thank you so much. I can smell you from 10 feet away, Leonard. Wow, that's crazy. Must be really strong. Leonard, You smell like shit.
So the Pictons in general lived somewhat of an isolated life on the farm, and the children especially, spending most of their time with the pigs and with each other. The eldest daughter, Linda, did have a bit of a social life, and she was out of the house more than the boys, but the boys mostly when they were young just hung out with each other and with the pigs. Red flag. Number 2, 3, I don't know. I'm not gonna keep track. And Linda was not surprisingly the only one in the family that turned out somewhat normal, because her parents actually let her go out and hang out with friends and bought her new clothes, new dresses. She was like the princess of the family, kind of. I mean, a princess of a filthy fucking family, but the boys basically spent their entire childhoods in the slop. And this was partially because they actually wanted to be at home with each other, but especially Robert, because Robert, red flag number, who the fuck knows, was obsessed with his mommy. Oh no. We know serial killers that are obsessed with their mommies. Uh-oh. Ed Gein, Ed Kemper. Oh, Ed's. I guess this is Robert. I don't know. Either way, I'm seeing patterns. They're gonna keep happening. Robert, like many other serial killers, had a very unhealthy attachment to his mother, Louise. And the only relationship he shared with his father, like I said before, when he even bothered to acknowledge Robert's existence, was to beat the shit out of him and be verbally abusive as well. And Robert was, let's just say, not the sharpest tool in the shed. He was known for only taking special ed classes when he was in school, and he would drop out when he was a freshman in high school. So between always smelling like manure, being antisocial, loving his mommy a little bit too much, and not being the brightest monkey in the barrel, Robert Picton got picked on quite a bit, believe it or not. Which I don't condone bullying, but now that I know that this man literally is the worst human being alive, I don't really give a shit. And one of the ways he would cope with being bullied would be to go home and hide in a fresh hog carcass until he felt better. So it's like the Revenant, except he didn't do it to live. He did it to... I don't know. I don't know. Guys, I feel like I look like a freaking dweeb with my glasses, but I literally can't see if I'm in focus or not, and I cannot see the document that I wrote, so I gotta go back to the glasses. I'm sorry. Sexy secretary, criminal Chris, coming at you. Here we go. Now, at 12 years old, Robert would have an important moment that happened in his life that he would go on to tell anybody that would listen as he became an adult. Robert, at 12 years old, would go to a livestock auction with $35 of his own money that he saved up. And for those of you who don't know, livestock auctions are where you buy animals, often to either have on your farm or just to butcher. Anyway, he would go to that livestock auction and he would spend his $35 on an adorable little calf to raise. Oh, like a little cow, so cute, I love it. And he would go on to raise this calf for a few weeks, and he was loving it, he was having a good time, and then one day, he would come home from school and he would look for his calf and he would say,
Dad! Where's my calf? I can't find it. Do you know where I put my calf?
And his father would say,
Oh, son, have you looked in the barn?
And little Robert would say,
No, Father, but I will. Thank you for letting me know.
So he walked over to the farm and he looked for his little cow companion, and when he opened the doors to the barn, he gazed upon his spotted friend hanging from his feet from the ceiling with his throat cut, bleeding into a bucket on the ground. And as he started to realize that his calf compadre had been butchered beyond belief, he heard a little chuckle from behind him, and it was his father, who was just playing a fun little prank on little Ricky. Like, can you imagine your father doing that? So as you can see, you can really start to smell the cereal pot of stew brewing. No, boiling, I think. Like, can you imagine your dad calling you downstairs to prank you, and he's just hiding behind the corner, and he's about to scare you when you come down, and he's like, ah! Also, taxidermied the cat on the kitchen counter. Am I right? No? Too far? Fair. Anyway, I do feel bad. I feel bad. That's f***ed up. That's f***ed up to witness as a kid. I mean, that's probably not going to make or break you as a serial killer necessarily, but I can't imagine experiencing that as a child. Like, there are plenty of people that are raised in less than ideal situations, and even on farms. Like, if you live on a farm, you know that a lot of the pets and stuff have to get butchered and stuff. And these people grow up being normal people and don't end up, butchering almost 50 women. So I'm not going to give him any leeway, if you will. So when Robert was 14, he and his family would move to a different pig farm in Coquitlam, British Columbia, Canada, which was just about 20 minutes away from Port Coquitlam. And Linda, Robert's older sister, would take this opportunity to get the fuck out of town, man. She went to Vancouver to stay with friends and relatives, and she was like, bye bitches, y'all are disgusting and I'm piecing out this bit. But 10 points for Linda. We love Linda, boss ass bitch. She got out of there at the right time, let me tell you what. Because this would be the farm where all of the heinous crimes and atrocities would take place in the years to come. And this place literally looked like a horror movie set. It's like the biggest horror movie trope location you've ever seen. Like, this is a farm you would see when you're walking by and be like,
Somebody definitely got murdered in that farm, I tell you what. Did you guys hear that scream?
and this land was literally littered with quicksand spots that you could very much potentially die in if you stepped in. And to top it off, there was a creepy, smelly lagoon at the back of the property. Really, all that was missing was a creepy guy in overalls that preyed on helpless women, am I right? Oh, wait, that's this guy! Again, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, man, that's all I could think of. So this farm had over 700 pigs on it. 700 pigs. And a couple hundred chickens stuffed into a couple different sheds and barns. And Willie, aka Robert, and Dave, just about to be out of high school, were slopping the pigs 3 times a day at this point. So they'd slop in the morning, they'd slop at lunchtime from school, and they'd slop at night, and they'd slop at night. That's hard to say. All while never taking a shower. Well, Dave sometimes took a shower, but Robert literally never took a shower. He would have to be forced to take it, and no one was really doing that. So this guy was a piece of shit that smelled like shit. It's just shit. And just like at the other farm and house that they had, they would continue to let animals come in and out of their house as well, pissing and shitting and eating whatever they could find. And at 15, Robert would get kicked out of high school for showing his nudie magazines that he brought, like the ones where like you hold it up and like the girl's wearing a dress, but then it drops down and then it shows her bosoms. He got kicked out of school for that. I feel like kids don't get kicked out of school. I feel like that's not that bad. I mean, again, he's a piece of shit, but I don't think that's that bad. But anyway, his mother was very happy because she got to spend more time with her son and she had a full-time employee on the farm now. Now, Dave, Robert's brother, on the other hand, was at this point getting very popular amongst his peers. He had more of a social group, he dated girls, he showered, but he was not an innocent guy, to say the least. And his rap sheet started when he was only 16 years old. In 1967, at the age of 16, Dave was driving his truck and he would hit a boy walking home from school. It was a 14-year-old boy named Tim Barrett. And after hitting him, he would severely injure Tim Barrett. And Tim was lying on the ground, but Dave would hop back in his truck and drive straight home and not call for any help. And after he drove straight home, he told his parents what had happened. And what did they do? They called the cops, right? They did the right thing, right? They called the cops and said, oh my goodness, my kid hit another kid and it's just terrible and we need to figure this out. No, Leonard, Dave's father, went to his truck, cleaned off all the blood, and began to fix it as to cover up the crime. And Luis went Mach 5 down the dirt road to where Tim Barrett was and proceeded to roll him off the road while he's barely conscious, dump him off into an embankment that was slightly flooded, and hope that no one would find him and that he would just die. So yeah, this is kind of where I'm saying that his parents were pieces of shit. And that is precisely what would happen when Tim was found a few days later. The truck hitting him is not what caused his death. He died by drowning. So Louise Picton actually killed this kid. And the only reason why we know that is because Louise later on in life told one of her friends this is what happened. So this is just a family full of psychopaths, a family full of just filthy mongrels. And despite being fairly well off with their farm business and with their meat locker business, where they would hold processed meat for people to come and pick up to consume later on, or hold meat that they butchered for people, this family would still go to local dumpsters and just hoard anything they could find and eat anything they could find. These people were rich. Like, they were well off into millionaires at this point, but they were just fucking filthy. I don't know how else to say it. So if you were to go onto this property, there would just be garbage everywhere and the house would just smell terrible. So by the early 70s, the Picton brothers were starting to establish their career paths on the farm. And these are the careers that they would continue to have for the rest of their lives, or until somebody went to jail. Dave was working in demolishing and construction, and Robert was working as an apprentice butcher. Red flag. And it was also at this time that Robert would gain the hobby of writing to pen pals. That's fun. I used to write to pen pals. That was very fun. I loved doing that. And his favorite woman to write to was Connie Anderson, who lived in Michigan, USA. And when Robert was 24, he would take a road trip for the first time out of the country and go to Michigan to meet Connie IRL, NGLLOL XOXO, Gossip Girl. Sorry. And shortly after he got down there, they actually got engaged, but it did not last long at all because Robert needed to go back to the farm in Canada, and Connie had a job where she couldn't leave in Michigan. And I'm just gonna say this, Connie, you dodged a bullet, all right? Or should I say a psychotic, mass-murdering, corpse-feeding human butcher? Am I right? Anyway, so Robert would inevitably go back home and continue working on the farm and continue working as a butcher. And finally, in 1978, Leonard Picton, Robert's father, would pass away at the age of 91. And the year after, his mother, Louise Picton, would pass away as well at the age of 67 with the cause of cancer. And you know what that means when both the parents are dead? Bring out the will! I don't care, they're pieces of shit. So at this time, the farm and the property, despite it being absolutely disgusting and full of garbage, was worth a whopping $1 million in 1979. And each child would individually get $90,000. And Robert's siblings would get the money right away, but Robert would have to wait until he was 40 years old to receive that $90,000, which was really interesting. But Robert, being his mommy's favorite, would receive an extra $20,000 up front immediately. And we don't really know why that is, but we're assuming that she just wanted him to remain working on the farm and she was his favorite, so she gave him a little extra cash. I don't really know. So this is when Robert and Dave would start their junkyard on the Picton property. They would basically start going around and buying used cars and scrap metal to put on the farm. And his meat business was also starting to grow in the community as well. For the business, he would go to animal auctions, buy animals, take them back to the farm, and butcher them for the locals. Whether it was cows, goats, pigs, llamas, and even emus. I don't know who the fuck is eating emus up here. I've never seen one in my life, but you're fucked. I mean, I don't really care about the emus. They're like giant dinosaurs and I'm terrified of birds, so fuck 'em. But what his customers didn't know is that Robert would save a lot of money by picking out animals that often were like sickly and diseased and were filled with sores and pus, which is so disgusting. But he's a business savvy man. I gotta give him that. And Robert's method to butchering these animals would be either to cut their throat or shoot them in the head with the nail gun to end their life. And then he would punch a hole through their ankles and string them up upside down to bleed them out into a bucket. And after that, he would proceed to dismember the animal and butcher it. And this would be the almost identical process carried out by Robert Picton to murder the dozens of women in this slaughterhouse as well in the years to come. And body parts of these women would accompany animal parts as well, as Robert would bury them in 40-foot holes around the entire property. Not only was he about to murder dozens of women in the near future, but he would also use this property for other criminal activity as well, including running a chop shop for the Hells Angels. And for those of you who don't know, the Hells Angels are essentially a very large criminal biker gang that is very prevalent to this day. I actually know people who have ended up in the Hells Angels, and these crimes span anywhere from money laundering, car theft, murder, etc. to get into this gang. So just not great people to associate yourself with, except if you're a serial killer. Sounds about right. So in 1980, Robert Picton would start taking the excess animal parts to a rendering plant in Vancouver, British Columbia, which is about 20 minutes away from Coquitlam. And it was called West Coast Reduction. Essentially, a rendering plant is where you take animal parts that are not fit for human consumption and they ground them down into a paste of sorts that they can use in cosmetics, soap, paint, etc. And I bet you can guess where this is going. Remember when I said he butchered women and got rid of them in the same way he got rid of the animal parts? Yeah. So there was literally human remains being dropped off at this rendering plant and unknowingly processed by the people at the rendering plant and shipped out around BC and all of Canada. And whatever scraps he did not take to the rendering plant, he fed to his pigs. And it just makes me sick to my stomach too. I can't even imagine the amount of disrespect, disdain, and just disregard for human life. Like I said in the beginning, these are mothers, these are daughters, these are sisters, and he's just disposing of them like animal scraps. Like I truly hope this man is just rotting away in jail with the never-ending existential dread and fear of the fact that he is going to be burning in an eternal flame for the rest of his godforsaken death. You know, I have the utmost sympathy for the victims and their families. And I just always want to reiterate that. Anyway, so after Robert would drop off the scraps at the rendering plant, he would be only a block away from his future hunting ground, which was East Hastings, Vancouver, which was a strip in which homeless and prostitutes were roaming in the hundreds. It was also known as the prostitute stroll, and still is to this day. Most of you won't know this, but I know this very intimately because I've spent a lot of time in Vancouver. It's really not that far from me, and I also, on a yearly basis, go down there to give out food and clothes to the homeless there. But this street is in horrible condition. It is extremely unfortunate, and I feel bad for a lot of these people. I know, you know, a lot of people can't control what happens in their life, and a lot of people can, but it's just extremely sad going to this street. I know a lot of people that have visited here and they see East Hastings, and it's like The Walking Dead, to be honest. So this strip was essentially a serial killer's playground, especially at this time. And the police, quite frankly, did not give a flying fuck what happened to any of these people on East Hastings. So it was basically a free-for-all. And we do know that another serial killer working around the exact same time, Gary Ridgway, was said to have picked up at least a few victims on East Hastings. And we know that because when the police caught him, they would find a map in his truck with the exact location circled. And another serial killer that was active at the time, Gilbert Jordan, was working in this area and was said to have murdered numerous female prostitutes, specifically Indigenous women, which was and still is a massive problem in British Columbia, specifically. Not only to prostitutes, but just in regards to Indigenous women in general. We have what's called the Highway of Tears in British Columbia, and over 40 Indigenous women have gone missing and have been murdered on that highway, and there has been little to investigate it, and it's just heartbreaking. Like, I really hope that I can bring some sort of light to that. Like, it's just, I feel so bad for the families of these women and for the victims themselves. But this was very common in that time and in this location, and also it was common throughout the states as well, especially in California with African American prostitutes as well. The police just didn't care, and that's what's so heartbreaking about the story, and that's how Robert Pickton was able to murder for so many years, because the judicial system was so flawed, and people weren't considered as people if they did a certain job, which is absolutely bullshit. And I truly hope that anybody that has family that has experienced this gets justice one day. So in saying that, let's continue. So the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Canadian FBI, if you will, these guys, I know, we never updated the uniform or the transportation. I don't get it either. Anyway, the RCMP did try to help the Vancouver Police Department in the early 90s during this investigation, starting Project Eclipse with a team of profilers in Vancouver. But it ended up not really going anywhere because the Vancouver Police Department didn't know at all what to do with their findings, because they're idiots. I don't want to say that about all of them. This is very, like, when I talk about the Vancouver Police Department in a whole, like, they neglected and they were not good in this case, but that comes down to the higher-ups. Like, I'm sure that there were so many wonderful police officers that really wanted to make a difference in the situation, but they can't do anything if the higher-ups don't provide funding and don't assign them to these cases. So when I talk about the Vancouver Police Department being neglectful, I'm talking about a few certain people that were prideful, ignorant, spiteful, and neglectful. And it was even more frustrating because Kim Rossmo, a world-renowned profiler, worked within the Vancouver Police Department. But everyone around him in the department despised him and refused to work with him just because he was a profiler and a higher-up, and he worked his way up the ranks a lot quicker than the police officers did. And it just reminds me of, like, every Criminal Mind episode when the FBI shows up to that small town police precinct and the police chief is just like, "What are you guys doing in our town? We don't need you." Well, there's a guy running around that has killed 15 people and you're sitting in your chair with your dick in your hand while Googling a very specific corn site that your wife probably wouldn't be too happy you're looking at. Isn't that right, Big Chief Daddy 69? How did you know that? We're the FBI, Chief. We're always watching. Anyway, Rosmo developed what is known as geographic profiling, which essentially states that serial killers often start within an area that they know best and slowly over time work their way further and further outside of their comfort area in killing people. He literally built an entire topographical computer program based off of this theory, and it was incredibly helpful worldwide. Like, people were using it everywhere, but the Vancouver Police Department, no! They're too smart. They didn't need him. Nah, we're good. You built that? You spent years developing that and it's worked for everybody else? Nah, we're good. Thanks, Thoy. That's nice to know, but no. And considering that this is exactly how Robert Pickton's case worked, with him working within his area and then working his way out, if they did use Kim's method, they definitely would have caught Robert a lot sooner. So we don't know for sure if this was Robert Pickton's first victim, but it's a very high chance that Wendy Louise Allen was Robert Pickton's first victim, because she was last seen being picked up by Robert on March 30th, 1979, and would never be seen again. And she would be the first of many over the next 20 years. His next victim was Rebecca Guno, who disappeared on June 22nd, 1983, followed by Yvonne Marlene Abagosis on New Year's Day, 1984. So you'll notice how the time periods between murders slowly gets shorter and shorter. He's waiting a long amount of time to start, but then you see how he gets more and more comfortable and sees that the police aren't really caring or not really investigating, so they'll start to become a lot more frequent. And in 2004, a former sex worker reported that she did report a friend that underwent an assault and a disappearance all the way back in 1984 on East Hastings, but it was never investigated. And that's a pattern that'll keep happening as well. A lot of sex workers noticed that their friends were going missing and would report it. The reports would not get investigated. So back on the farm at this time, this started to become a place to hang out for criminals, basically. It became the place to be for lowlifes in Coquitlam. It was a place to drink, to party, and commit crimes. Am I right? Just kidding. And this would be the most ideal crowd to be associated with for Robert Pickton and Dave Pickton, because all of these people didn't give a single what they were doing. To be fair, most of them didn't know what to extent that they were doing these crimes, but still, they didn't care. They just used them for their property, basically, and piggybacked off of them. Am I right? It's a terrible joke. But Dave, Robert's brother, like I said before, was the social one of the two, and he would be the one to socialize with everybody, and everybody would kind of just keep their distance from Robert, because he was widely known as just fucking weird, and he would never let anybody go into his room, which who the fuck would? Basically, Dave was a cool brother, and Robert was the really weird brother that it just came along to hang out because your mom said he had to, and people just tolerate him because they had to. Now, despite being a weird, smelly Robert always managed to maintain at least one relationship with a woman at a time, and a non-violent relationship at that. And one of those women was Tanya Carr. She would end up moving in with Robert when he eventually moved into a trailer on the property for 18 months. 18 months this woman endured this man's stench and presence. But during these 18 months, it was said and is kind of widely known that Robert didn't murder anybody during this time, or within about a 3-year gap between him murdering people. So her presence clearly changed something within him. I'm not sure how that works, but unfortunately she would leave, and shortly after that murders would start up again. So from 1992 to 1995, there wasn't any murder happening that we know of. But I think after Tanya left, this might have triggered something within Robert, and shortly after he would take 4 women prostitutes to his farm, and they would never be seen again. And the only reason we know that is because of a survivor by the name of Tracy gave testimony about it. Tracy was approached by Robert on East Hastings in 1995, and he was looking for a BJ. Gross. And Tracy said she almost didn't get in the truck because the smell was so rancid. But alas, she did end up getting into the truck, and Robert Pickton would drive the 30 minutes back to his farm, where they went to his trailer, which she said didn't smell much better than his truck. Anyway, something that Tracy did notice was that the trailer was filled with women's clothing and jewelry, which, red flag, no. But she ignored that, and she went back, did her job, and then when it came time to pay her, Robert would look for his wallet and then accuse Tracy of stealing the money from him. He would then grab a knife and put it up to her face and cut 2 buttons off of her shirt, but she was able to talk him down, and he ended up driving her back to East Hastings. But on the drive home, he would brag about how he was a white knight and a savior of prostitutes and would try to give them a second chance by getting them off drugs. And if he didn't get them off drugs, or if they relapsed after he tried to save them, he would murder them. He just blatantly confessed to this woman that he had killed multiple women. And this is something that's very common amongst serial killers, especially ones that go after women of the night, if you will. They have like this white knight savior complex, and then they also have this godlike complex that they can rid people that are less than them from the earth. And Picton was very much one of these killers. So going back in time a bit, Robert used to have a friend when he was a child named Lisa Wells. And they would eventually grow up, kind of separated and apart, and then Lisa Wells would end up actually having a kid with Dave Picton, Robert Picton's brother. And she would end up living on the property and becoming very close with Robert as well, like as friends. And he would kind of listen to whatever Lisa said. Lisa was the only one that could convince him to fucking shower. So they were very close. And she also remained steadfast that she did not know any of the crimes that were happening when they were happening, which, like, come on. She was even quoted as saying,
"You know, I always had it in the back of my mind that Willie was a serial killer. I was never afraid of him myself. I knew he would never hurt me, but everyone else? Well."
But she says she didn't know that he was doing anything, but she had a really good idea. Hey, maybe listen to your instincts. All right? I don't know. Maybe look around a little bit. I don't know. So this is now around the time where Dave and Robert's parties on the farm were getting bigger and bigger. And they were selling a lot of meat during these parties and finding a lot of success. So they figured, hey, might as well make this into a proper establishment. And that is when the Piggy Palace would become a lucrative business on the property. And it would be at this time where Robert's victim count is now getting into the teens at this point. But this place was legit. They had security, food, bartenders, live music, a dance floor. Like, this place held a lot of people. On a good night, the boys would be bringing in $10,000 to $40,000. Like, this was the place to be. And these Piggy Palace parties weren't only attended by, like, low-life criminals at this point. They were attended by, like, off-duty officers and just regular locals at this point. Like, this was, like, the Piggy Palace was the place to party, you know what I'm saying? So in 1995, a victim of Roberts was found for the very first time out of all of his victims so far. She was unrecognizable and unable to be identified because all that was found was one half of her skull that was cut in half, and this was found in a lagoon of sorts off of the property. So she was considered a Jane Doe. But by the time she was found, it's probable that Robert had killed almost 20 women at this point. And when police would go and investigate this piece of evidence, they would note that the skull was cut in half, and it was cut in half with a saw. And it was assumed that it was done by somebody with a butchering history. Who do the cops know that they are friends with that butcher things on a regular basis? It's right there! It's fine. And they would find a particular substance on the skull that meant that this piece of bone was kept in a freezer for a very long amount of time before it was discarded. And later on, when Robert would eventually be caught, they would find a rib bone on Robert's property that would match the DNA of the skull. So we know it was Robert's victim. And they would find 2 other heads cut in the exact same way as the skull found in the swamp in one of Robert's freezers as well. But those heads were found on the farm in 2002. And the skull from the swamp was dated all the way back to 1994. So that just shows that he was already in this comfortable killing routine for the past 10 years, using the same methods on his most recent victims. And we don't know how this head ended up off of his property, given that it was the only piece of evidence that was ever found off of his property. My guess is that he was probably dropping something off at the rendering plant and found that this head was in there and maybe threw it out the window or something. I'm not sure, and I don't think we'll ever know. And we do know that Robert would never take heads, hands, or feet to the rendering plant because they were too recognizable, and he didn't want to run the risk of people seeing that. So he might have just taken the head by accident. I don't know, like when you forget your keys. I don't know how that works. So by early 1997, Robert's victim count was almost at 30 at this point. And it was at this time the women of the night were getting more and more apprehensive about getting into Robert's vehicle, or anybody's vehicle at that point, especially going to a much further location like Coquitlam, because it was about 30 minutes away. But Robert didn't really have an issue with this because he would just offer them a lot more money than they would sell their services for. And he would also offer them drugs on top of that as well. Because at this point, Robert was a millionaire. Dave and Robert were doing very well with the Piggy Palace, the meat locker, the chop shop yard. They were doing very well for themselves. So he was able to throw money at whatever he wanted. And if he ended up murdering somebody, he wouldn't have to pay them at all. But this is one of my favorite parts of this story. So one night, Sandra Ringwald, a boss-ass queen bitch. She's not a bitch. She's awesome. A working girl from East Hastings got into Robert's truck and took the half-an-hour trip back to his pig farm. Once they entered his trailer, she took notice that a large kitchen knife was just sitting on the kitchen counter. And then she proceeded to go back into Robert's bedroom, which was just a gross mattress on the floor, and she would have intercourse with him. So after her services were complete, Robert would go to pay her, and Sandra would ask to use his phone so she could call her pimp to say that she was done her services and that she was on her way back to East Hastings. And while she was looking at the phone book to look up her pimp's number, she would feel that Robert was approaching her from behind, and before she could do anything, he grabbed her right wrist and slapped on handcuffs. But before he could grab her left wrist, she flung around and went into full bad bitch beast mode and started to beat the shit out of Robert. And while she was doing this, she recalled the knife that was on the kitchen counter, and she would pick it up and start slashing at Robert, slitting his jugular and stabbing him in his face through his cheek, cutting some of his jawbone and breaking out some of his teeth. Fuck yeah, it's fucking metal, dude. And although she got these blows in, Robert was just fucking Frankenstein and just kept coming towards her. So Sandra, realizing she had no other option, she just ran and busted through Robert, busted through the trailer door, and got outside. But Robert would follow quickly behind her and wrestle the knife out of her hand and end up stabbing her twice in the abdomen. Luckily, he was starting to get weak from blood loss, so she was able to wrestle the knife back from him and wrestle off of him and sprint towards the public road while carrying her intestines in her hand. Like, I would have given up. To be honest, I don't know if I have the strength to do, like, this woman is my goddamn hero, all right? So she's running with a knife, carrying her intestines, waving down a car, and this older couple would come and pick her up, and she would be absolutely frantic. And not knowing if she was going to live or die, she would point back at the farm and say, "If I die, that man killed me." This couple would take her to the hospital, and police would show up as well. She would tell them the story, and they would go back to Robert's farm. And this is a happy ending, right? Oh my gosh, they're gonna catch him because he did all this bad stuff? No, of course not. Of course not. The police would go to Robert's farm and see him dying in a pool of his own blood and take him to the hospital. But unfortunately, Robert was able to easily talk his way out of the situation and just say that Sandra held him at knife point because she was robbing him and it was just in self-defense. But the police would actually do something and charge him for attempted murder. But when the day of court came, Sandra didn't show up to testify because she was absolutely petrified of what Robert and Dave, his brother, might do to her if she didn't win the trial, if it didn't go her way. So Robert got off scot-free and would continue to kill for 4 more years. But at this time, word had spread about what Robert had done. So you'd assume every working girl would be wary of giving Robert any business. But it was at this time also that he would hire on a con artist prostitute by the name of Gina Houston that would aid in the flow of non-stop working women doing services for Robert and getting murdered. So they met in 1993 and they quickly became partners. Robert would pay her rent and give her extra cash, and Gina would promise the prostitutes that she knows this man with a ton of money, a ton of drugs, and a good time. And usually about 50% of the time they would agree to go. And of course, when it came to testifying, Gina denied that she ever knew that Robert was killing any of the women, even though she was said to have known over 30 of the women that were never seen again. So she's just like,
no, I mean, I knew them intimately, and I saw them all the time, and then I never saw them after I was with Robert, but I mean, who's to say? You know?
You're a piece of shit, Gina. So in 1997, Robert would kill the most women he would ever kill in a single year. And that number was 14 women in 1 year that we know of. And the police a year later in 1998 would say, quote unquote, "There is no indication of a serial killer here." What? So there's over 30 women that have disappeared from the exact same place, and these police are still in denial of that. Like, or they just don't care. And that is my personal opinion, is that some of the police officers, the higher-ups, just definitely didn't care or prioritize sex workers, and it's disgusting. Now, by 1988, there was a $100,000 reward from America's Most Wanted. Not even the police, but a TV show took notice of the whole situation that was going on and even did an expose on it and offered $100,000 Canadian to anybody that could come forward with information about this case. And at this time, there were definitely a few people that could have come forward and completely blown this case wide open. And one of them was Robert's friend, Andy Williams. Andy Williams had been one of Robert's friends for a while and also lived on the property. A lot of Robert's friends lived on the property. It was really big, but you'll find that a lot of these people that were associated with him at some point lived on the property. And for some reason, Robert loved to share all of his secrets with Andy Williams. So one night in 1999, Robert asked Andy if he wanted to go get some from East Hastings, which, like, as your buddy does, you know? And this is the night that Robert would open up and tell Andy what he really liked to do with the prostitutes. And Robert would show him. So Andy would say that Robert would lift up his mattress and show him the tools that he used to kill these women. He would show Andy a pair of handcuffs, a belt, and a piece of piano wire with 2 handles on each side. And then he told him he would pick up the women from the east side and bring them back to his trailer, have sex with them from behind, and as he was about to finish, he would slowly grab their arms and take them from behind and handcuff them and then proceed to strangle them to death. Then he told them after they were dead, he would take them back to the barn, hang them up by hooking through their ankles, bleed them, gut them, and then dismember them and feed them to his pigs and take the rest to the rendering plant. And after telling Andy this, it absolutely freaked him the fuck out, and he skipped town. He left. No shit. Robert, a few days later, realizing he screwed up by telling Andy this, tracked down Andy and beat the absolute living fuck out of him within an inch of his life, and scared Andy so much that he never went to the cops until later on when Robert was already caught. And another person that witnessed Robert's atrocities was Lynn Ellingson, a friend of Robert and Dave's that also lived on the property. So one night, Robert and Lynn would go out and buy some crack, as you do with your friends, you know? And they would also go to East Hastings and pick up one of the women of the night to take back and party with and smoke crack with, as you do. So they would go back to the trailer, all smoke crack together, and then Robert would eventually take the woman that they got from East Hastings back to his bedroom and have sex with her. And while they were doing that, Lynn just went and smoked some more crack, as you do. And then when she came back to see where they were, she couldn't find them. So she was looking around the property for Robert and would come across the barn and see the light on. So she would walk in and see women's legs hanging from the barn ceiling. Naturally, she screamed, and Robert would come up to her, grab her arm, take her to the table where he was dismembering the woman, and make her stand there and watch as he finished. And all Lynn said was that she kept her head down, and all she could see was organs and body parts being thrown into a bucket on the ground, and a big clump of hair in the middle of the table. And by that testimony, we know that Robert was scalping his victims before dismembering them, so the hair wouldn't get caught in his saw. All of this makes me nauseous. I've read so much about all of this, and I just, I couldn't eat. Like, it's just so heartbreaking. I can't even express it. I'm so sorry to the victims and their families. Just want to keep reiterating that. And Robert, you're a piece of shit, and I hope that you die a violent death. Is that too much? Nah. But anyway, this is just screaming Texas Chainsaw Massacre. I'm just thinking about Texas Chainsaw Massacre, man. But after this incident, Robert gave Lynn a ton of money for booze and drugs, and Lynn would stay drunk and high for weeks after this, which naturally, like, I can't even imagine witnessing that. And she was scared out of her mind. So she did not go to the police either until after Robert was already caught. But either way, somehow, these stories did make it back to the cops, because Andy and Lynn told other people about these stories, and they would make it back to the cops, but it would still be another 2 years before Robert Pickton was charged with any of the crimes. They just completely disregarded these stories as rumors. So by the year 2000, Robert had replaced his con artist her, Gina, with an even worse and more evil accomplice, Dina Taylor, a terrifying woman to say the least. She, like Robert, hated women of the night and was happy to get them off the streets in any way she could, even if it meant sending them to their inevitable demise at the Piggy Palace. She would end up using the same method as Gina, telling the women that this man had a ton of money, drugs, and a good time, but she would say that it was her uncle, so it would be even more trustworthy, essentially. And when Robert was caught a few years later after this, Dina's DNA would be found on over 113 items on the property and crime scene. Like, I don't know if she was fucking slipping, sliding through these fucking pig pens, but she was not innocent in any way, and there was zero repercussions for her. So in March of 2001, Robert would take another 3 victims, and some people in the VPD were finally starting to take notice and see the pattern that was happening. It only took you fucking 20 fucking years. But despite having blatant stories from people backing up the fact that Robert has murdered dozens of women, that still wouldn't be the reason why they would go to the property and search it. It basically happened on accident, and this is how it happened. See, Robert Pickton had another friend named Scotty Chubb. Yes, Chubb. I don't... Anyway, living on the property as well with his wife, Tasha. And one night they got into a domestic dispute and the cops were called, and a rookie cop was sent to the scene. And Scotty would tell the rookie that he got upset because his wife was doing and he didn't want her to be doing, and the rookie cop was actually in the drug division, so he asked Scotty if he knew who the dealer was, and Scotty said he didn't, but the rookie cop would give him his number and say, well, if you know anything further about who's dealing these drugs, just give me a call. So this guy went to a domestic dispute and then just asked this criminal woman abuser if he could help him with his own job, basically. Anyway, luckily, Scotty Chubb would start to run out of money because he was unemployed and he needed some rent money. So he figured he could be a little bit of a snitch and call this rookie cop back and maybe make a few bucks. And who did he have to rat out on? This guy he knew with illegal firearms in his trailer on the pig farm. And who is that? Robert Pickton. So the police finally got a search warrant for Robert's farm, all because of his shitty friend that ratted him out for rent money, which is kind of hilarious, but just fucking crazy. You know, like all this evidence, all the signs, everything, and then it just takes this one fucking idiot to do this. I mean, I'm glad it did happen, but it's just insane to me. Like, Selena would never, you know? So on February 6, 2002, the police would go to Robert's farm, would bust down his trailer door and find one illegal firearm, and they would arrest him on the spot. And as they searched the trailer more, they would find a box full of knives and a piece of paper on the floor with a name on it, Heather Bottomley, which was a woman that went missing back in 2001, but that wasn't enough evidence to charge him of anything, so they kept looking. Under a pile of clothes in the trailer, they would find one of the most disturbing pieces of evidence I've ever heard of, and it was a .22 revolver with a curved dildo pulled over the barrel. Like, what? I don't even want to know. I don't even want to know. And they would also find an inhaler in Robert's office with one of the victims' names on it, Serena Abbotsway. And she was last seen on August 1st the year before. Although this still wasn't enough to place charges, it was enough for police to get a property-wide search warrant. So next, they would go to the slaughterhouse, where they would find pig corpses hanging from the ceiling and women's clothes, jewelry, and sex toys strewn about. But they still hadn't found a body or any body parts yet. So as the forensic team took to Robert's farm, Robert had got out on bail, and they had sent an officer to speak with him and tried to get a confession out of him. And it did not take long at all for this to hit the media. Like, as soon as the cops were searching the property, this was just, it went gangbusters all over the media, and I remember it.
Good evening. There are growing calls tonight for a public inquiry into the Robert Pickton case as more details emerge.
Pickton was charged and convicted of killing 6 women. Trade workers connected to Vancouver's downtown east side. Other gruesome details revealed DNA of the murdered women found in processed meat on his farm.
Like, there was just so many people speculating about this case, and there were so many people that were scared as well. So 10 whole days later, after searching the property, the police would finally found an orange cushion and a mangled metal mesh shower hose, both stained with blood. And with this DNA found, the police would finally have a match to one of the victims, Mona Wilson, Robert's last victim, and this would be enough to put him under arrest. So although Robert was arrested, they still needed to figure out where the other 48 women were. So while teams searched his property, the police would absolutely grill Robert for a confession on a daily basis, and they would also put a cell plant into his cell to try to coerce a confession as well. And you know Robert, he loves telling secrets, doesn't he? So after warming up to his cell plant, he did open up a little bit and basically just said how he loved being famous and being in the media. He said to him, quote unquote, "The whole fucking world knows me. All the way to Hong Kong to everywhere." A very well-spoken scholar. He wasn't that smart.
Another phrase is, also no shit. That's why it's part of it.
And his voice was also just awful. It was so awful. You couldn't even understand him half the time. The cell plant at this point would not obtain a confession, so the cops continued to hound him in the investigation room for weeks. But Robert would not budge. Even when they said how his own friends had told the cops that he was murdering women, he would literally just say, "Oh, they're out to lunch. They're just out to lunch." If you don't know what that means, that's a very common Canadian saying, which means like, "Oh, they're crazy. They don't even know what they're talking about. Oh, like, get out of here. Get out of town." But it's just so dumb. Anyway, but after weeks of hounding Robert, one of the cops would say something that would crack him. And it would be simply this: "Willie, you didn't do a good job of cleaning up those girls' blood. You've got to agree with me." And Robert would respond,
"The restrictions with managers. You check yourself. You get better than 10 minutes. I buried my own people grief. He's like,
like, what? That's what he just kept saying, is that he was sloppy and that he didn't clean up right. And although that's all he said to the cops, once Robert went back into his cell with the plant, Robert could not contain his excitement and secrets anymore and would end up sharing everything with the cell plant. By the end of the night, Robert confessed to killing 49 women, adding that he almost made it to the big 50. That was something he kept saying, that he wished he could have made it to 50. So while the confession was happening, the cops were continuing to search Robert's property and Robert's workshops as well. And they would find 2 5-gallon plastic buckets in one of his meat locker freezers. And they didn't see it at first because it had a massive film of freezer burn ice. So they would wipe it down and see the horror that lied within these buckets. And they would find in one bucket, there was 1 head sliced in half, 2 hands put in one side of the skull, and 2 feet put in the other side of the skull. And the other bucket would contain the exact same thing, just of a different woman. And the cops would find even more body parts in the piggery. A sewage company would need to pump the piggery for 4 straight days before it was empty, because Robert never cleaned it or emptied it in 20 years. So it was a lot of pig shit. And after it was all pumped out, the forensics team would have to sift through all of it by hand. By hand. Oh my God. There were over 100 people working there day and night for years, sifting through Robert's property piece by piece. And they would find thousands of fragments of not only animal parts, but also human remains. But one mystery in this case is that they would never find any leg bones or arm bones. Out of all of the thousands of pieces of evidence they found, they never found, and they never knew where those ended up. And on July 15th, 2002, 2 officers were searching through 2 of his other freezers, and they found 3 plastic bags full of ground meat. They were originally put into storage for 4 months by the cops, assuming it was just pig meat, but they would test it and find that it was made of 2 types of meat: pork and human flesh. And this ground meat would match 2 of Robert's victims. And with the amount of ground meat that Robert would sell and give away, it kind of goes without question that there was human remains in this meat. But despite this incredible obvious evidence and the circumstances in which it was, there was no official recall or announcement to the public about this. It's just another giant W for the police. I'm just kidding. It was a fucking massive. Like, knowing this now and like I remember hearing about this later on, like everybody, it's just so disheartening and sickening. And like to think that parts of people are in products or meat, it's like you can't even wrap your head around it. Like I can't, it's hard to even think about. And I'm just so incredibly sorry to all the families. Now, when the preliminary trial happened, Robert was charged with 27 counts of first-degree murder, each of those counts having human DNA attached to them. So, like, without a doubt, he was guilty of them, essentially. But the judge for Robert's case was either grossly incompetent, hiding something, or just had a hatred for sex workers, because this entire trial should have been a slam dunk, wham bam, thank you ma'am. But this judge would straight up say charging Robert with 27 murders would take too long. And one of the murders he just completely dismissed, the one that we talked about in the very beginning that was a Jane Doe, because she was never identified, so she didn't count to the judge, which is fucking disgusting. So he took the now 26 murder charges down to only 6, with the promise that the other 20 would be charged against Robert later on. And the issue with this is that the prosecution team was not able to use any of the evidence in the other 20 cases in the 6 women trial. So they weren't able to relay information from those cases or make connections, which completely took away from the case, which obviously affected the jury and their final decision. And the judge also said that Sandra, the badass bitch that carried her intestines and a knife and got away from that piece of shit Robert Pickton, wasn't able to stand trial because she wasn't one of the victims technically. So she wasn't able to stand trial because she didn't fucking die. Which I reading this is it's just I can't even wrap my head around it. Like this whole case is just infuriating. And I mean the Canadian judicial system is already flawed in many ways, as are many other judicial systems, but this case is just, it highlights it so much. Anyway, I digress. So the defense was able to convince the jury enough that maybe Robert wasn't fully culpable of committing these murders. And he was found guilty of only 6 counts of second-degree murder, instead of the 27 murder charges in the first degree he was first charged with. And after the trial, the forensics team would find enough evidence to put Robert's murder count to 33 women. But in 2010, the Canadian Supreme Court ruled that there would be no further trial for Robert Pickton. So Robert Pickton was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of parole, but now these families go without justice for their family members that underwent the most horrific end-of-life experiences. Like, I wish that these families got justice and that these victims got justice for themselves, but they didn't because the system failed them, and it's just heartbreaking. I'm glad this monster is in jail and will never see the light of day again, and I hope that he's getting beat the shit out of, and I hope that he's thinking about his eternal flame at all times, but it's still incredibly sad that it ended this way. But that concludes this video and the story of Robert Pickton. Thank you for hanging around for as long as you did. I know this was a longer one, but this case was definitely a tough one to get through given that it was so close to home. But like I said before, I really enjoy doing these deep dives. If you guys want me to continue doing them, give me some suggestions down below. And make sure to like the video if you like the video. Also subscribe if you want to subscribe. This is obviously the best YouTube channel ever. Okay, I'll see you in the next one. Bye!